For my money, there are few series finales as strong as King of the Hill's To Sirloin with Love. But if you're a big King of the Hill fan like me, you might also know that To Sirloin with Love wasn't actually the show's first attempt at a series finale. Back in season 11, it appeared as though the show was going to be canceled by Fox, and so when the production team realized this, they decided that the episode Lucky's Wedding Suit would make a fitting series finale. That's why so many characters from the show's history show up to Luanne's wedding, even if it doesn't make all that much sense that they would be there. But what I didn't realize until recently is that an entire additional sequence was animated for this potential series finale, and then scrapped when the show was renewed at the last minute. Recently, series writer and producer Jim Dauterive actually posted this original series finale in its entirety on Facebook, and let me tell you, it is absolutely fascinating and even includes a reveal that the entire show takes place over one single year. You ready?
Yep.
So like I said, this newly uncovered alternate ending for Lucky's wedding suit has some absolutely wild reveals and implications, but first, let's talk a bit about Lucky's wedding suit as a finale. While I don't think the episode itself is a great candidate for a final episode of the series, the final scene is really great. Luanne is such a huge part of the show, and the entire series began with Luanne moving in with the Hills. I appreciate that Luanne getting married and officially starting her own family is a place where the show could have potentially ended. Plus, I've always loved when they use Mangione's Feel So Good at emotional moments in the show, and the transition from the wedding march into Chuck, it's excellent. I also appreciate this little emotional outburst from Hank.
I've got, well, I guess you'd call it emotions.
There is a lot to like about how they executed these final moments. That being said, the original ending makes a lot more commentary on the series as a whole in super interesting ways. Apologies for the low quality video. For now, all we've got is Jim Dauterive's cell phone recording of the final version, but it's better than nothing. First of all, there's this wild revelation that I mentioned up top.
Boy, I can't believe it was just a year ago that Luanne's mama stabbed her daddy with a fork and she moved into our house. Feels like 10.
So yeah, this alternate ending reveals that the entirety of the events of all 11 seasons of King of the Hill up to this point had taken place over a single year, despite the continuity that states otherwise. And this, I think, is a pretty funny bit, especially for an episodic sitcom that takes place in a floating timeline. Obviously, it can't possibly take into account the fact that there are multiple Thanksgiving and Christmas episodes, or the events that were pretty specific to the year they took place, like the election, but I still really appreciate this. Jim Dauterive actually talked about it in his Facebook post as well. I wrote the end scene you see here with the conceits that writers had often joked about that the entire series had taken place over 1 year. Continuity be damned. So it's pretty clear to me that this was always sort of meant to be tongue-in-cheek, a way to acknowledge that the characters never age and have a fun reveal for the end of the series. The scene continues with some great shoutouts to classic episodes, and the context of them all taking place in the same year is very funny.
We had a twister and a flood. We burned down the fire station. Bobby burned down our church.
Unless we forget the Megalomark blew up and killed Buckley and darn near killed you, Hank.
So this is referencing the episodes Texas City Twister, Après Hank Le Deluge, A Firefighting We Will Go, Revenge of the Lutefisk, and Propane Boom Parts 1 and 2. I love that they've just highlighted all of the craziest stuff that's happened in Arlen over the series. It all sounds so absurd when listed back to back. They continue to allude to the greatest hits and list all of Hank's various ailments throughout the series, and then they say something really interesting.
Remember that time I stole the tank from the army base?
That never happened. And I wasn't born in a bathroom at Yankee Stadium while Cotton tried to kill Castro with a blow dart.
The clip goes on to explain that these episodes were actually just vivid dreams that Bill had after eating at a Hungarian restaurant in Manger. So this is wildly fascinating. Basically, at the 11th hour, the writing staff decided to decanonize a couple of major episodes in the show. Jim Dauterive talked about this too. We even bought back some of the events of the series. For instance, Bill stealing a tank. Mike Judge never really liked that as he felt it was too big and kind of shark jumpy. And native Texan that I am, I never liked Hank being born in New York. So for one, it's really interesting to hear some of the regrets that Mike Judge and the writers may have had over the course of the show's entire run. I really love the episodes they mentioned personally, but the fact that they were going to completely decanonize them is really wild. It's interesting. And I actually think it also probably speaks to how Judge & Co. might approach the upcoming King of the Hill revival. They could pick and choose which stuff they maintain continuity with. Will they ignore or decanonize the fact that Hank was born in New York? Would they bring back Cotton even though he dies in season 12? Is there anything they might change continuity-wise to address the loss of Brittany Murphy and Tom Petty as Luanne and Lucky? Mike Judge also recently brought back Beavis and Butthead, which is great, by the way, but that show went a very interesting route with how they modeled modernized it. The film, Do the Universe, actually went to great lengths to explain how Beavis and Butthead moved from 1998 to 2022 via a wormhole. But despite this, when the show returned and the duo lived in 2022, they still just brought back all the same characters from the old series at the same ages they existed in back in 1998. No real explanation why. So it seems like Judge is willing to fudge the timeline for the stories he wants to tell. Granted, I know King of the Hill is much more reliant on story and continuity than Beavis and Butthead, but it's still, I think, a worthwhile precedent to look at. Okay, let's dive back into this alternate finale because there are a lot of things to love about the way they wrapped this up. After the bit about Bill's vivid decanonizing dreams, they start to list off some of the wilder things that have happened over the series once again.
Heck, I wish it was a dream when I got arrested for fishing with crack, or when Peggy had pictures of her feet taken for perverts, or when Bobby was a husky boy clothes model.
I think what I love about this little sequence is specifically the way the gang smiles as they think back fondly on all of these events. It mirrors us as the audience, remembering how fun and ridiculous those episodes could be, just as our time in Arlen is coming to a close. It's really nice.
Yeah, that boy ain't right, but he's a good kid. All in all, it's been a pretty good run this year, I tell you what.
But I think the nicest touch here is everything that follows. The gang gives their usual yeps. Hank feels the back of his neck where a mosquito sits, flying off. The camera pans up, 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 all the way to the Arlen Water Tower, where the series would have ended. This final shot perfectly mirrors the pilot episode's opening shot, which pans down from a sky-high view of Arlen until a mosquito comes into view, which then lands on Hank's neck as he smacks it with his hand. A beautiful and symbolic way to end the series. Now, like I said, Lucky's wedding suit certainly would not be my choice as a series finale, but I have to give them credit for what they pulled off in this added finale sequence. It does some really fun stuff, references back to the series with admiration, and beautifully mirrors the opening of the show. I still think To Sirloin with Love is a much better finale. In fact, it's about as perfect of a series finale as you can have, but I really appreciate their first attempt here, even if fate had different plans. And before any of you comment, yes, To Sirloin with Love is the series finale, not another manic Conde. The show was cut short by 4 episodes on Fox, and they burned off the remaining 4 in syndication, so though they aired afterwards, To Sirloin with Love was always meant to be the series finale. Every time I refer to it as the finale, I get comments arguing that it isn't. It is, I promise. But wow, I had no idea this alternate ending existed until recently. It's a shame that all we've got for the moment is this cell phone record of a screen, but Jim does say he's working on a better transfer, so hopefully we get that one day. It really is a fascinating piece of King of the Hill history, and absolutely one of the most interesting things I've ever seen hit the cutting room floor in just about anything. In an alternate universe, this aired as the series finale for King of the Hill, and while I don't think it's quite as satisfying as the ending of To Sirloin with Love, I do think it made a really valiant effort and leaves me feeling pretty good at the end. And if you want to see this alternate finale clip uninterrupted in full, I'll put a link in the description of this video so you can check it out yourself. But what do y'all think? Did you know anything about this alternate series finale? Do you prefer it to the finale we ultimately got in season 13? Let me know below in the comments, and of course, let me know what King of the Hill topic you want me to talk about next. Let's talk about the King of the Hill fan theory that Bill is Bobby's biological father. So I never really planned on talking about this theory, but I've gotten a lot of comments about it. I mean, it's not like I'm the first to break it down. There are tons of Reddit posts and videos about this exact subject. The ladies of the Ho Yeah podcast, which is a podcast that every King of the Hill fan should be listening to, broke down this theory in detail in one of their episodes. Hell, even Matt Pat, the film theorist himself, did a full-ass video on the idea, although he talked a whole bunch about Punnett squares and recessive versus dominant genes, which, you know, that's cool, but I'm not here to talk about biology, I'm here to talk about King of the Hill. So I started looking more into this theory the other day after sort of outright rejecting it for years, and I gotta say, there are some interesting pieces of evidence, and after poring over the details and reflecting on the series, I do have a pretty firm stance on the theory. So, without further ado, let's discuss the most controversial yet compelling King of the Hill theory. Is Bill Dauterive actually Bobby's real father?
Hank, if I don't act honorably, there's no point in preserving my name. It's just a word that women have trouble remembering.
So, as I said, I have to admit that there is some pretty interesting evidence in favor of this theory. When you look at it all out of context and side by side, It feels really compelling. So let's dive into it. One of the biggest pieces of evidence is just Bill's general obsession with Peggy. He's clearly strongly attracted to her, and a lot of the pro-theory crowd believes that this stems from the fact that the two of them may have slept together in the past, conceiving Bobby, and that Bill's ongoing obsession is a result of sharing this one intimate experience with Peggy and then desperately pining for another taste of that experience. And there are, admittedly, some pretty weird moments from Bill that could be seen as hints towards this idea. In Escape from Party Island, when Hank takes a trip with his mother and her friends, Bill becomes weirdly obsessed with taking care of Peggy and Bobby, like to a stalkerish degree.
You gave me a key, remember? When you went on vacation, so I could feed Ladybird.
That was 6 years ago.
He even shows up at Bobby's baseball game and starts to yell at the coach about putting Bobby in the game.
Weren't you playing Bobby Hill? I am responsible for that, boy. You play him now! You hear me?
And this isn't even the last time that Bill gets awkward at one of Bobby's sporting events. Look at this clip from Bobby on Track.
You think Bobby's bad? Imagine if we had a child.
I would say that this is pretty typical Bill behavior, but I will also admit that Peggy's reaction is actually a tad unusual here. She looks really uncomfortable and shifts awkwardly, but generally when Bill makes these kinds of weird remarks to Peggy, she very vocally shuts him down.
I'm having a barbecue this afternoon. See you there.
No, you will not.
Is it possible that Peggy knowing the truth prevented her from wanting to draw any more attention to this idea? And then there are situations that are just even more blatant.
In a moment of weakness on a dark, rainy night, I slept with Peggy.
No, you didn't, Bill.
I know.
Yeah, this is played off as a joke with Hank shutting down Bill immediately, but Bill is incredibly weak-willed, and many could read this as him walking back his confession after Hank presses him. The gang was in dire straits, and this could have been the last chance Bill had to confess to Hank, and it's a really weird thing to say if it isn't true, even by Bill's standards. So if we're gonna continue down this theoretical path, this is where you have to look at Bill and Bobby to determine if they share any real similarities. People generally point out their appearance, both being sort of chubby with big round heads, but I think this is kind of weak evidence-wise. Bill was actually quite fit when he was younger, but there are some things that the pair share. When the crew goes to visit Bill's family in New Orleans, something very interesting happens to Bill as soon as he arrives.
Je m'appelle Bill Dauterive, j'aime garde pour ma tante Esme Dauterive.
He instantly takes to the Cajun lifestyle despite never having really lived it. He even admits himself how unusual it is that he picked everything up so quickly, like it was a hidden memory or something.
I had no idea that you spoke Cajun.
I had no idea either.
Interestingly, in this episode, though, Bobby also takes pretty quickly to the lifestyle, to hilarious effect.
Well, I need a window seat because this flower is wilting.
Bobby certainly didn't get this from Hank or Peggy. Could it be the Dauterive in him? Bobby and Bill actually bond a handful of times over the series as well, but none is more compelling than the episode Blood and Sauce, when Bill starts to cook barbecue using the secret Dauterive family recipe. This entire episode revolves around Bill lamenting the fact that he's the last of the Dauterive line, and he won't have anybody to pass these familial traditions down to. In the end of the episode, Bill decides to pass the Dauterive family recipe on to, you guessed it, Bobby Hill. Pretty interesting, huh? And if you subscribe to this idea, then you have to start looking at it logistically. And this is honestly where I think the most compelling evidence comes in. In Pregnant Pause, we learn the entire backstory to Peggy's pregnancy and Hank's narrow urethra. In fact, Hank's sperm count is so low that the doctor basically tells them it would be next to impossible for the couple to conceive naturally.
I really don't think you'll ever have children.
Hank even refuses to try in vitro fertilization, which, side note, pretty messed up, Hank. Now, the episode explains that having a puppy, Ladybird, around the house is what made Hank relax enough to conceive a child with Peggy, but this was ultimately just Hank's opinion of how it happened. There's obviously absolutely no medical science at play here, just Hank's assumptions. I would say the astronomically low chances that Hank and Peggy could conceive a child naturally is by far the biggest piece of evidence for this theory. So if this were the case, how would this have played out? Well, Peggy was very upset at Hank when he refused to try in vitro fertilization. Like, devastated. Is it possible that in her frustration and desire to have a baby, she went to her neighbor Bill and secretly conceived a child? Now, Bill would still have been with his ex-wife, Lenore, at the time, but her extramarital affairs hardly seem to be a secret. Perhaps Peggy used this to her advantage when trying to seduce Bill into doing this with her. That's really the only instance I can think of in which this could possibly happen, unless lots of alcohol was involved. Hell, Bill seems to know a lot about Hank and Peggy's struggles to conceive, and I think it's very safe to say that Hank Hill did not disclose this information. So how did Bill learn it? When you look at all this stuff side by side, like I said before, it's very compelling. Compelling enough for some viewers to go all in on the theory. But this is where I've got to jump in and portray the flip side, because though I think this evidence is really fun to sift through, in the end there are a lot of holes, and the lack of context for some of these situations make them appear more in favor of the theory than they actually are. For instance, if we look at the episode Blood and Sauce, the episode where Bill passes down his family recipe to Bobby, the entire premise of the episode revolves around Bill's depression over his lack of family. He is absolutely devastated, thinking that he has no real family left and that he will never have a child to continue his legacy. Now, if Bill knew that Bobby was his biological son, would he have really felt this way? Bill and Bobby have bonded on many occasions. If he knew this truth about their biological connection, certainly that would have meant something to him in this existential crisis. And yes, in the end of the episode, it did mean something, but this wasn't portrayed as anything but Bill embracing the friendship that the two of them had formed. I think if the writers were trying to tell us this biological connection subtextually, this is not how they would have portrayed it. Speaking of subtext, let's talk about his obsession with Peggy. Yes, the theory dictates that this obsession stems from a long lost connection that the two of them had in conceiving Bobby, but other episodes of the show have basically refuted this. Bill of Sales might at first appear to support the theory, showing the lengths that Peggy would go to avoid Bill and his weird obsession with her, but after the two conquer the pyramid scheme Sales world, Peggy shows the most affection for Bill she's ever shown.
You are a kind, hardworking, superhuman people person who's taking us to nationals. Oh, Bill Dauterive, I love you.
And what is Bill's reaction to this?
What are you doing? Stop it! Leave me alone! Keep the jacket, keep the pen, I quit!
Yes, this was an instance of Peggy using Bill for personal gain, but if Bill's obsession with Peggy truly stemmed from his own knowledge that Bobby is his biological son, there's absolutely nothing in Bill's past as a character that would indicate he wouldn't jump at this chance to be closer to Peggy. Instead, this episode actually explains that Bill is basically attracted to the way that Peggy negs him. She constantly belittles and berates Bill for being disgusting and slow, but the moment she changed her tune, Bill was repulsed. In order to get him back in her court, Peggy literally just starts to prepare insults for him, which eventually cause him to want to help her again. Peggy has a stern, tough, no bullshit nature. It's her massive ego and the negging that comes with it that seems to attract Bill to her. At least that's what this episode depicts. And then you've got the stronger familial stuff at play here. Namely, that Bobby looks a hell of a lot like both his grandfather KotH and Uncle Good Hank. And honestly, though people claim that Bobby looks more like Bill than Hank, I'm not sure I agree with that. It feels like people really latched on to the fact that both are on the chubbier side, but I don't think Bobby really looks all that much like Bill. In fact, when you look at the flashback in the episode Halloween, young Hank looks nearly identical to Bobby. So if you're gonna base this off of resemblance, and KotH, young Hank, and GH all look like Bobby, I'm not sure what other conclusion you can draw. Now, I've also seen some people try to really extend the theory here by saying that maybe KotH is actually Bill's real father. They do, after all, have a strange bond over their times in the armed forces. But to that, I'd have to say, I hope you don't hurt your back from that reach, my friend. Not only does this just get into really convoluted territory story-wise, but this basically negates everything we learned about the Cajun Dauterive heritage, and ignores the fact that Bill seemingly had this entire Cajun side of him lying dormant until he visited his family. So let's talk about this from a writer's standpoint. Why would the writers want this underlying secret in King of the Hill? It's basically something that is never explicitly stated, but should inform a lot of the characters' actions. But what purpose would that serve these characters or the story? The show already openly discusses similar subjects through the Gribbles and John Redcorn. If they were doing the same thing with Bill and Bobby, did they ever intend on pulling out that rug from under us? Or was this always meant to be a background detail for fans to argue over? Do the writers want us, the audience, to be the subject of the Peggy's headache situation, where we are in fact the last to learn what everyone else already knows? I ultimately just don't see how this idea serves the fundamental core of King of the Hill, which is the story of Hank and Bobby trying to relate to each other as a father and son. It's definitely possible that they could tell an effective story in which Hank learns the truth about Bill and Bobby, but chooses to love Bobby all the same, knowing that he is in fact his true father, having raised the boy and everything. But it just feels like this is a really sweaty journey to get there. So much of the turmoil between Hank and Bobby is Hank's complete lack of understanding of how Bobby operates. And on a certain level, this is because this is Hank's flesh and blood. If that boy ain't right, ultimately boils down to that boy actually being a biological Dauterive, someone else that Hank thinks ain't right, this wouldn't challenge Hank's worldview in the same way. It would give Hank a reason why that boy ain't right. But the point of the show is that Hank learns from the things he doesn't understand about Bobby. It just doesn't feel like this type of reveal would serve the nature of the show. In the end, I think the Bill and Bobby theory is fun. I had a good time digging through old episodes and re-examining character relationships, and I think if you have fun poring over the details for these theories, good on ya. Keep doing it. But for me, too much of the evidence comes in the form of confirmation bias. On top of this, there are too many contradictions to the theory within the text of the show, and the idea doesn't quite mesh with the most important themes and through lines of the series. But everyone should watch this show the way that brings them the most joy. And if these conspiracies and theories do it for you, hey, more power to you. One of the most scandalous aspects of King of the Hill is, of course, Joseph Gribble's parentage. Though he's raised by his mother Nancy and father Dale, everyone knows that his biological father is John Redcorn, whom Nancy had an ongoing affair with for years. Everyone except Dale, of course. And though this is initially played off as a gag at Dale's expense, the most suspicious, cynical, paranoid character in the entire show, failing to see the obvious conspiracy right under his nose, they use these complicated relationships and character dynamics to great dramatic effect. On one hand, you've got a paranoid but loving father with a great relationship to his son, and on the other, a sad man who longs to connect to the son he never really had. So let's dive into the complicated relationships between Dale, John Redcorn, and Joseph Gribble. So first, a little history. 2 years after Dale and Nancy got married, Nancy met John Redcorn, and they began a long-term, ongoing affair. While Dale was on a trip to Marfa, Texas to observe the famous Marfa Lights, Nancy and John Redcorn conceived Joseph. The joke from the very first episode of the series is that despite his overly conspiratorial nature, Dale fails to see the obvious truth in front of him.
Nancy, you've been going to that healer for 12 years and you still get headaches every night.
I've talked about this before, but there are of course many who subscribe to the theory that Dale actually does know the truth about Joseph, John Redcorn, and Nancy. He just chooses to appear ignorant to mess with people. While I get why this sounds fun on the surface, it doesn't really track for me. Not only does it sort of just eliminate the obvious joke of it all, there are also countless scenes and episodes that simply don't make sense when you take this into account. We see Dale alone all the time, and even when talking to himself, he maintains that level of ignorance. If he was faking it, why would he do that alone? Dale goes to extreme lengths to remain ignorant of the truth too. In season 6's Of Mice and Little Green Men, he basically puts together all the pieces to discover the truth about Joseph's biological parentage.
Now that Joseph's hit puberty, the differences are impossible to ignore. We don't look alike. We don't have the same interests.
He does the math, realizes that he was out of town when Joseph had to be conceived, and that Nancy was with John Redcorn. So obviously, he's got to figure it out, right?
Joseph's real father is...
Nancy loves you.
An alien.
What?
Dale ends up telling Joseph that he's an alien, which ironically ends up proving how much of his own personality Dale has instilled into Joseph. Joseph goes full paranoia, travels to Marfa, Texas to find his real alien father. He even ends up expanding on the ridiculous alien theory for Dale.
But isn't it possible that first they abducted you, stole your genetic material, and then used that to create me?
While this is obviously baffling, it is kind of sweet. At the end of the day, Dale and Joseph do have this strong bond as father and son. Dale is a nut, but he's almost always there when Joseph needs him. I think this is a pretty significant mark against the Dale actually knows theory as well. This episode is basically just him telling Joseph he's an alien to mess with him, which is cruel and not something I see Dale being willing to do to his own son, because the two of them have a really sweet father and son relationship.
Yeah, that Joseph, he's really like his dad.
This is affirmed in season 3's episode Peggy's Headache, when Peggy is the last person, besides Dale, to realize the truth about Nancy and John Redcorn, which of course sends Peggy spiraling for 2 reasons. 1, because of the shock of the situation, and 2, because she was the last to figure it out, and that hurts her ego. But it upsets her so greatly that she nearly tells Dale the truth. The thing that stops her is seeing that Dale is such a caring father. He gives Joseph all the money in his wallet to rent a movie and buy some candy.
Oh, wait, I found some more. Can't watch Encino Man without milk balls, huh?
Thanks, Dad!
This does illustrate something pretty interesting about this entire situation. Nobody tells Dale the truth about what's going on with Nancy and John Redcorn, even though literally everybody knows. Maybe it's because Dale is such a volatile person. They don't really want to mess with what is generally a very happy family, despite the lies and deceit. Dale is happy, Nancy is happy, Joseph is happy. Which does bring us to the John Redcorn of it all. I think some of the most interesting development they gave John Redcorn is his growing interest in being a part of Joseph's life, and the dramatic tension of this interest potentially messing with that aforementioned happy family. But though there's no real defense of John Redcorn and Nancy's actions, I have a really hard time not empathizing with John Redcorn in regards to Joseph. It's very clear that John Redcorn loved and cared for Nancy. They treated it all like an actual relationship despite the fact that they were running around behind Dale's back. And again, no defense for infidelity, but the reality is that had Nancy met John Redcorn first, she definitely would have married him, not Dale. Before she broke things off with John Redcorn, John loved Nancy, and so of course he laments the fact that he cannot have a meaningful connection with her or his biological son. The season 5 episode Spin the Choice is all about this pain. John Redcorn not only wants to properly forge this connection, but he wants to share his Native American heritage with Joseph as well. But there's obviously that major obstacle. How do you share that without the truth of the entire situation?
Shug, he's Dale's son, remember?
But it's so clear that this genuinely hurts John Redcorn, like on a primal level. He misses Nancy and he wishes he could have a real relationship with Joseph. He literally cries about the situation to Hank, which of course makes Hank deeply uncomfortable, as a deeply repressed human being. But the problem here is that John Redcorn starts to become a little bit resentful. The situation is complicated. I empathize for him, but he isn't really acknowledging how complicated the situation is. He starts to equate his son being raised by Dale to theft.
To the white man, who steals our land and steals our sons.
To the white man!
Which is obviously a bit hypocritical, given that he was sleeping with someone else's wife. John Redcorn's attempts to connect to Joseph and help him understand their Native American heritage actually ends up alienating Joseph further. Bobby basically proclaims that people from John's tribe were cannibals, grossing out Joseph and embarrassing John Redcorn.
That was over 700 years ago!
Get your hands off me, you cannibal freak!
A quick side note, some people argue that this makes John Redcorn a hypocrite, as he's claiming reparations from the government that stole his ancestors' land, while he denounces the cannibalism that took place from his ancestors generations ago. But frankly, this is an embarrassing false equivalence. Land and wealth are literally passed down generationally. His ancestors losing their native land directly affects his modern well-being. The specific actions of some of those ancestors genuinely has nothing to do with the reparations he's owed. It's a bizarre reason to be anti-reparation. And besides, this episode is focused on the anguish that John Redcorn experiences in his very complicated life situation. And empathizing with people on a human level is what this show is all about. And when Joseph expresses his own discomfort with John Redcorn, Nancy does the right thing because she knows John Redcorn is being treated unfairly here. We don't see it, but she clearly effectively explains the plight of John Redcorn and his Native American roots to Joseph, who changes his tune. John Redcorn fully intended on telling both Dale and Joseph the truth, but Joseph's new attitude changes his mind.
Mr. Redcorn, I know you're not really a cannibal. My mom told me. She told me a lot of things.
And I actually think the resolution here in this episode represents a pretty great middle ground for John Redcorn's paternal woes and the Gribbles' continued familial happiness.
We're all children of the earth, so in a weird way, we're related.
After Dale helps John Redcorn procure 12 acres of land from the government, John opts to put Dale in his will to inherit it, so that it will then be passed down to Joseph. It's a really nice gesture and a way for John Redcorn to share his actual heritage with Joseph without dismantling the Gribble family. I really appreciate this solution and this sort of father from a distance angle that John Redcorn takes the remainder of the series. It sort of allows Dale and John Redcorn to both have some hand in Joseph's life, which admittedly seemed to be the case from an early age, though in maybe a more hands-on approach. Because on one hand,
when Joseph was a baby, who changed his diapers? You or some alien?
I did.
Who took him to his first day of kindergarten?
I did.
But on the other hand,
who taught him how to tie his shoes?
John Redcorn.
Well, okay, but who taught him how to ride a bike?
John Redcorn.
And though John Redcorn did keep his distance after the events of Spin the Choice, there were instances where he needed to step in, generally when Dale was on some dangerous conspiratorial nonsense. In Vision Quest, John Redcorn initially tries to help Joseph while keeping this distance, facilitating through Hank. He notices that Joseph is hanging out with a troublesome crowd and up to no good, and tries to help Hank lead Joseph on a vision quest.
There comes a time in every boy's life when he must decide to be good or bad.
Now, on the other hand, Dale has a very different reaction to Joseph's troublemaking friend group.
Whoa. Those were the coolest kids I've ever seen. and they appear to be friends with my son.
While Dale is shown to be a generally good father to Joseph, he obviously has some interesting tendencies. He flies off the deep end with his conspiratorial nature a bit too often, and in this case, that coincides with one major insecurity. Growing up, Dale was never cool. He has long-standing regrets about situations that he felt could have made him more popular. So when he sees Joseph have success with the cool kids, even ones who aren't good for him, he tries to live vicariously through Joseph. On top of all this, Joseph's vision quest goes entirely wrong and Dale has one instead, the vision basically revealing to Dale that Joseph is a Native American, which of course, Dale does not properly interpret.
I fathered an Indian child, therefore I am an Indian.
So with Dale's newfound confidence as a quote-unquote Indian, he then improperly interprets Joseph's own vision quest. Joseph has a guilty conscience that his new friends plan on going to the zoo to paint their names on the pandas. So in his dream, he's running with a herd of buffalo only to be trampled by them and then confronted with a panda. I think anyone could interpret this properly. The crowd he's hanging out with are ultimately going to harm him, but those aforementioned insecurities that Dale has about popularity completely dictate his interpretation.
The dream means go with the herd. Those kids are your destiny. They could be your one shot at coolness.
Even worse, Dale convinces Joseph he needs to kill a panda at the zoo to lead the herd. And this is where John Redcorn takes a hands-on approach to prevent Dale from leading Joseph down a truly wrong path. Joseph never actually wanted to do anything bad to this panda, but he trusted his dad. And Dale's obsession with validation and attempts to live vicariously through Joseph led them to this truly ridiculous and dangerous situation. Fortunately, John Redcorn steps in.
I'm not shooting the panda.
Like a lead buffalo. Strong, independent. That will be your path.
Now, interestingly, I think that strong and independent actually properly describes two important characters here in addition to Joseph, Dale and John Redcorn. Obviously, these manifest themselves in different ways, but I do think they both fit. Dale is very confident in his worldview, and that worldview is absolutely independent of most other people's. He is strong in his opinions, no matter what people say of them. John Redcorn is, of course, a very independent man, very physically strong, but he's also got to remain mentally strong through the anguish and insecurities he feels about Joseph. And he has to remain independent of parts of his life that are important to him. The relationship between the Gribbles and John Redcorn is an interesting one. Though it is born of infidelity, Nancy and John Redcorn do eventually break off their affair. There's no excuse for what they did, but they do both eventually feel regret and try to set things right. Dale and John Redcorn even form a strong friendship of their own, with Dale helping John Redcorn get his reparations. When it comes to Joseph, I have a hard time not empathizing with both John Redcorn and Dale. One person knows the truth, but may never be able to fully connect with his blood. The other lives blissfully in ignorance, unlikely to learn the truth of the matter. But ultimately, I think Joseph is actually better off with both Dale and John Redcorn being a part of his life to a degree. Though John Redcorn generally stays away out of respect for the Gribble family, the times he's intervened actually have helped Joseph grow as a person. Dale is a loving, caring father, and though his paranoia might lead Joseph down the wrong path on occasion, he is persistently there for his child and has a great relationship with him. Joseph loves his father, and he respects John Redcorn. I think the ways King of the Hill portrays these kind of complicated relationships is its greatest strength. It doesn't shy away from condemning certain types of behavior, but it also doesn't paint each situation as black and white. We can have a problem with John Redcorn and Nancy having an affair, while empathizing with a man who cannot have a proper relationship with his son. We can take issue with Dale's paranoia putting his son in danger, while also recognizing how often he's been a great father. And that's about as true to life as you can get. Luanne Platter is just the best. She is seriously one of my favorite characters on King of the Hill, not to mention just an incredible voice performance from Brittany Murphy. But I think what makes Luanne most interesting is how resilient she is, how much she overcame throughout the show, and how she grew into a stronger, more independent person through those trials and tribulations. Luanne's story is also pretty focused on agency. She's a character who is constantly being told what to do and how to think, and her character works best when she takes her destiny into her own hands. And though I may have a few issues with how they handled her story in the latter seasons, I still think overall, she has one of the strongest arcs of any character in the series. So let's do a deep dive into the life of Luanne Platter.
Stop telling me what to do! I am a proud, ignorant woman, and no one is going to change that.
Luanne has a pretty interesting backstory from the very first episode of the show, and it does a great job establishing some of her insecurities that we would see explored throughout the series. Luanne's living with the Hills because her mother Leanne stabbed her father Hoyt with a rusty fork. Leanne was sent to prison for this, and Hoyt was later arrested and sent to prison for unrelated drug charges. So from the beginning of the show, Luanne is going through major and difficult changes and adjusting to life at her aunt and uncle's house. I think Luanne struggled early to find herself as well. She was always reliant on others, though she got way less love and respect than she deserved. In the first real Luanne-focused episode in season 1, Luanne's Saga, Luanne thinks her boyfriend Buckley is going to ask her to move in with him. She frames this in an interesting way when talking to Hank.
Isn't it neat? I'll be going from Daddy to you to Buckley.
I think the way she says this shows not just her limited worldview of a woman's place in the world, but a lack of belief in herself as well. But Luanne's needs and well-being are often overlooked by the people around her. Like when Hank saws her beauty school mannequin head in half because Bobby was practicing kissing on it, he was only thinking about his own discomfort at Bobby's situation and didn't think for a moment about how important this was for Luanne's beauty exam. Hank did of course often make up for it when he could, and he did help her pass this beauty exam in the end.
Yep, this is my all-time favorite haircut.
Thanks, Uncle Hank.
It's also shown that Luanne is, to a degree, pretty easily manipulated. In episodes like Halloween, she pretty quickly buys into Junie Harper's anti-Halloween fear-mongering, and things like this kind of happen throughout the show. In The Perils of Polling, she's convinced to join the Communist Party, and then immediately changes her mind after hearing a single speech from George W. Bush. I think these are things that also sort of convey the lack of belief in herself. She's often looking to follow other people's lead. But I do think that throughout the first 5 or so seasons of the show, we see some really substantial growth from Luanne, and it's conveyed in a natural and gradual way. Luanne is constantly working towards her goals and dreams despite a lack of support from her family and Buckley. Meet the Manger Babies is a classic episode and highlights a lot of Luanne's trauma and fears surfacing, while also showing her push herself forward in a lot of ways. Luanne discovers some cute puppets at a garage sale, and she immediately shows a knack for making up characters and stories on the fly. As simple and silly as it is, you can't deny that the idea of the Manger Babies is somewhat creative. A show based around all of the animals that witnessed the birth of Christ actually just sounds like a real piece of Christian media.
That was the best dang Christian puppet show I have ever seen.
But in some ways, we actually see that Luanne's expression through the Manger Babies represents a lot of her own repressed emotions. When she creates this villain character for the Manger Babies, it's clear that she's giving him some of the traits that she's experienced personally.
Like he won't call you on your birthday and he throws beer bottles at your head.
It feels to me like this is probably Luanne venting about her own father and home life. And of course, she makes Hank his arch rival and literally casts him as God. Throughout this episode, Hank was actually there for Luanne in her time of need, which was clearly incredibly important to her.
I sell popcorn and popcorn accessories.
It was more than just Hank helping her with a puppet show, it was her new father figure supporting her as a person. So when Hank decides to ditch Luanne's televised puppet show to watch the Super Bowl, this sort of destroys Luanne's entire worldview.
If Uncle Hank lets you down, honey, it doesn't mean that the world is a bad place.
Oh, yes, it does.
Fortunately, Hank does the right thing and shows up just in time to save the Manger Babies and restores Luanne's faith in the world. But I do think that though this was a sweet moment for Luanne's relationship with Hank, it does sort of represent that same issue I talked about earlier. Luanne often looks to others to lead her in life, often people who don't fully support her all of the time. We see this in full swing in the season 2 finale when Luanne doesn't have the tuition to continue paying for beauty school. She needs to find a way to come up with $300, and Buckley doesn't even consider helping her out.
All I have is $400, and that's going towards my new trampoline. I mean, the trampoline I have now is good, but you know.
A lot happens in this episode. Hank is let go from Strickland Propane when the Megalomart starts selling propane, and then Buckley hires Hank to work in that department at Megalomart instead of Luanne, who studies really hard to get the job so that she can keep paying for beauty school. Obviously, Luanne feels incredibly betrayed by both her boyfriend and uncle in this situation. Neither were willing to help or support her, and when she tried her hardest to support herself, they prevented that from happening. Luanne decides it's time to break up with Buckley, who obviously hasn't shown much support for her throughout the show. Personally, I see this decision as significant growth. Luanne is standing up for herself and cutting out someone who doesn't care for her in the way that she deserves. Of course, she definitely couldn't have expected what happened next. The following season is a trying one for Luanne. Buckley dies in the Megalomart explosion, and her hair is also burned off. Though she tries to deny that she's sad about Buckley, she goes through some pretty significant grief. This leads to what I think might be my favorite episode in the series, Wings of the Dope. Not only is this episode beautiful, but it represents probably the most significant growth from Luanne that we see in the show. Luanne is actually visited by Buckley's angel, and I can't play this sequence for you guys properly for music copyright reasons, but do yourself a favor and watch it. It kind of makes me cry every time. But when Luanne is visited by Buckley, she shows that exact problem I've been talking about. She starts to see Buckley as her guardian angel. She is looking to Buckley's angel to lead her and help her through her difficult beauty exams.
Buckley has come back from the dead to bounce on his trampoline and help me with my exam.
Rather than finding the motivation and belief in herself, she is once again leaning on another person. But throughout the episode, she realizes that she can't even rely on divine intervention, especially from her shitty ex-boyfriend.
You are mean! Just like when you were my boyfriend!
The end of the episode has two incredibly important developments. First, something happens that allows her to see herself differently. When she crashes her car, a bunch of students at Arlen Community College think Luanne is their classmate.
Wait, you thought that I was in school with you? In college?
Up to this point, Luanne's insecurities didn't really allow her to see herself as being capable of going to college and getting an education, but thanks to this perspective shift, she decides that she should give school a shot. The second thing that happens is that she actually lets Buckley go. She says goodbye to his angel and moves on, even when he wants one last kiss.
No, that part's over.
Why?
Chicken thigh.
And for a while after this episode, it seems like Luanne continues to grow into an independent woman with much more agency and less reliance on other people. Episodes like Moving On Up actually show Luanne move out of Hank and Peggy's house and start to become more responsible. Though it's a struggle, she learns to fend for herself, and when Hank offers her help again, she declines.
No thanks, Uncle Hank. You taught me how to fish.
I love this line because to me it represents what Luanne's trajectory should have been throughout the show, and in some ways, it was. She does eventually decide to leave Arlen Community College after rediscovering her love for hairstyling.
Miss Platter, you in my class to learn history or, do hair?
Hair.
And though she is able to find a job and start supporting herself as a hairstylist, she also moves back in with Hank and Peggy to save money. It seems like she took some steps forward in certain areas of her life and backwards in others. There are episodes like Pygmalion where Luanne loses all agency again in a new relationship, or episodes like Girl, You'll Be a Giant Soon where Luanne is once again being treated like a child. But then there are also episodes like Boxing Luanne where in the end Luanne shows her toughness and grit on her own terms. It feels very much like through these middle seasons, the writers were at odds with what to do with Luanne. Do they push her forward as a more independent character, or do they continue to showcase the types of stories where Luanne's good-hearted nature is taken advantage of? Which is why I ultimately have mixed feelings about Luanne and Lucky. Now I do want to say that I actually do quite like Lucky as a character, played by the legend himself, Tom Petty. On one hand, he is a truly good guy, and there's much more to him than meets the eye. He absolutely loves and cares for Luanne, there's no doubt about that, and being with her actually drives him to improve himself as a person. In fact, I even like Luanne and Lucky as a couple. They're very cute and they show how much they care for each other. The issue I have with Lucky is how they treated the writing surrounding Luanne after his introduction. There are certain aspects I think worked well, such as Luanne making her own decision to date Lucky despite Peggy's constant interference and objections. To me, this is a good evolution of those previous shortcomings we've seen, where Luanne is constantly looking to others for guidance. Being with Lucky was a decision that Luanne made purely for herself, and I love that. But on the other hand, once Lucky was introduced, a lot of his stories really started to overshadow Luanne, and I think in a lot of ways their relationship showed a bit of regression for her character. I think the prime example of this is how they treated Luanne's father returning in season 12 versus how they treated Luanne's mother returning in season 2. Back in season 2, in the episode Leanne's Saga, Luanne has to face the truth about her mother head on. She sees firsthand the issues that Leanne has and how they negatively affect those around her. She has to accept that her mother isn't actually a positive presence in her life and watch her leave once again.
Come on, Luanne. Let's get out of this dump.
But in Life a Loser's Manual, when Hoyt returns to see Luanne, she is overwhelmingly sheltered from the truth by Peggy, Hank, and Lucky. And while it's sweet to see the lengths to which Lucky would go for Luanne, it kind of bothered me that in the end, they weren't willing to tell Luanne the truth about anything regarding her father. She didn't know that he was ever in prison, or that he had gotten in trouble again, and they continued to lie that he was working on an oil rig, all to keep her blissfully ignorant.
I'm so proud of Daddy.
We all are, baby girl.
Personally, I'm not a huge fan of treating Luanne like a child like this, and it feels like they veered way off course from the development that had been so great through the first 5 seasons, and solid in the first 8. But though I do have issues with how Luanne seemed to be a little sidelined in the later seasons, I do think that they managed to come back around for one of her most important episodes, Lucky Sea Monkey Do, when she gives birth to her daughter. While this wasn't the final Luanne-focused episode, this one does at the very least acknowledge that overall arc that was vital to Luanne's story. Throughout the episode, Lucky's sister and Peggy are basically fighting for control of how Luanne and Lucky will raise their child, as they both come at parenting from a completely different angle. And in the end, when it looks like she's going to listen to Peggy, she recognizes that she needs to find her own way as a mother.
No, wait. I don't want to do this your way either. I want to do this my way.
This is certainly the most important event in Luanne's life, the birth of her daughter, and it's incredibly gratifying to see that for this story, they chose to hone in on that major thing that Luanne struggled with throughout the show. To me, this left Luanne in a pretty great place, and while I do wish we could have seen a bit more of this firsthand in the latter seasons, the destination is still important. In the end, Luanne is one of my favorite characters in King of the Hill, and I'm really glad that she was given a challenging journey. So I'd actually like to end this video talking a bit about Luanne's voice actor, Brittany Murphy. The final episodes of King of the Hill were recorded just a few months before her tragic death, and it's not an understatement to say that this show would not have been nearly as great without her absolutely incredible performance as Luanne. You can feel Luanne as a character through Brittany's performance, and there was no better actor to take her through this journey than Brittany Murphy. I'll just leave you with Brittany's own words about Luanne.
She is a joy to be. She's bright and she lightens up all the dark corners of my head. She like comes from the brightest, most corner of my brain.
I've done a lot of King of the Hill videos now, and there's one character analysis that's been requested endlessly since I started. Bill You know what? No. Let me do this properly. William Fontaine de la Tour Dauterive. So yeah, Bill Dauterive. And for good reason. He's a super interesting character with a ton of depth, and there are so many Bill-focused episodes and stories to dive into. And honestly, I think people are most interested in diving into how absolutely pathetic and lonely he is.
Go back to your house.
Which is understandable. It's seemingly the most obvious trait Bill has. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who didn't think of the word pathetic when talking about Bill Dauterive. But through watching a couple dozen Bill episodes, I found that while, yes, Bill is incredibly pathetic, he's also by far the most selfless character in the series. And honestly, the patheticness and selflessness do go hand in hand sometimes, but I think it's definitely worth highlighting this lesser perceived side of Bill. So join me as we explore how Bill might be the kindest character in King of the Hill. So much of Bill's unhappiness stems from his love life. His ex-wife Lenore left him on Christmas 7 years before the events of the show, and his loneliness is both the subject of many episodes and the leading culprit for Bill's very embarrassing behavior.
Coffee for the two of us.
No, thanks.
No, if you're worried the caffeine will make you need to move your bowels, I live right across the street.
So yeah, it's obvious why the most common reaction to Bill is cringe. He's pathetic on a fundamental level, and especially early on, the Bill-focused stories took this route. Season 2's Leanne's saga is one of the first where Bill is a major player. When Luanne's mother Leanne is released from prison, she starts shacking up with Bill, which goes kinda well at first, but eventually, being so damn lonely, Bill spends all of his money keeping Leanne happy, which prevents him from being able to afford his toe fungus medication.
Oh God, what is that?
Yeah, what? Oh, that's just a little fungus.
This is actually sort of an example of both things that this video is about. This all makes Bill look pretty spineless and pathetic, but he's also being completely selfless, sacrificing his own well-being to keep Leanne happy. And in Season 3's Pretty Dresses, they put Bill's pathetic nature on full display as he continues to hold on to hope that his ex Lenore will come home even 7 years later. He goes through so many coping mechanisms, buying her Christmas gifts, buying an iguana and naming it Lenore, and then finally wearing all of her old clothes and pretending to be Lenore.
Don't you recognize me? I'm Lenore.
What is going on?
Again, pretty obvious why Bill is seen as pathetic. Sometimes they really lay it on thick. But when the show starts to dive deeper into Bill's past and his more genuine tendencies, he actually has a pretty deep history of selflessness. The dude actually didn't graduate high school so that he could enlist in Vietnam, and I think it's safe to say that Bill was doing what he felt was the right thing to do in that situation. He put the well-being of others above his own. In 403, Bills Are Made to Be Broken, a high school football player is going to break Bill's long-standing single-season rushing touchdown record. Rather than being petty or angry about it, Bill is actually genuinely excited for Ricky, even after Ricky gets injured and they coordinate a stunt to give him the record unearned. Even after that, Bill is happy for him.
Bill, there's being a good sport, and then there's just plain being cheated.
Though ultimately Bill was convinced by Hank to rejoin the football team to regain his old record, even in his old age, thanks to the fact that he never graduated. This episode almost paints Bill's selfless nature as a negative, like he doesn't do enough for himself, and it's illustrated pretty well here in this sequence, when Bill could have done the selfless thing and tossed the ball to his teammate, but he chooses to push forward himself. Cool way to illustrate that little bit of growth. Because though Bill is incredibly selfless throughout the series, it's definitely majorly detrimental to his own well-being on many occasions. Like when he does an obscene amount of free work for Peggy when she starts working at a multi-level marketing scheme, Bill becomes a master salesman and totally propels her scheme to success, despite not really getting anything in return. I think seasons 5 and 6 really struck a good balance with Bill's pathetic nature and his selfless acts. Hank in the Great Glass Elevator is a prime example, when Hank accidentally moons former Governor Ann Richards. Bill takes the fall for Hank, and his selfless act actually scores him a short-lived relationship with the governor herself.
You took the fall for a friend, and I find that a whole lot more attractive than Hank's bony ass.
But of course, in the end, Bill loses the governor because Lenore comes back into his life, and it's pretty fitting for Bill to regress to a pathetic mess the moment his biggest heartbreak comes back into his life. Though he does end things with Lenore in a really satisfying way, so I like this bit of growth. Season 6's Tankin' It to the Streets is another that balances the duality of Bill. This episode reveals that Bill may have been experimented on in his time in the army, which led to some of the bodily changes he went through since high school. While he resents what happened to him, he actually becomes more confident, believing that the things that make him pathetic weren't actually his fault.
So, it's not my fault that I'm fat, bald, and lazy?
Or that your breath always stinks like rotting garbage.
Until, of course, he learns that Dale was misinformed and that he only took a placebo while in the army.
It means everything is my fault. The fat, the fur, and all those other things I didn't even know were wrong with me.
But in the end, we see just how selfless Bill can be. He literally puts his own life on the line to protect his friends on this army firing range. In fact, they fully think that Bill died, and Hank even cries.
I'm gonna miss him.
Seriously, can you think of any other times in the series where Hank actually cried? I remember him crying when his truck started to break down, but I think that's it. I can't think of any other times. Bill really means a lot to Hank, and he's a really good friend. And this isn't the only time Bill was a great friend. In season 10's Bill's House, he single-handedly nurses the entire Hill residents back to health when they all get sick. He literally pushes aside everything else just to take care of them. When Hank collapses in his driveway, Dale and Boomhower just laugh, but Bill carries him inside himself. Bill really cares about the Hills. Heck, he even passed down his family barbecue recipe to Bobby to help support his own dreams and desires to cook. But in the entire King of the Hill series, I don't think any episode showcases Bill's selfish friendship better than season 6's Dang Ol' Love. This is one that really highlights his desperation initially. He falls in love with a jogger who runs by his house in the morning without even ever talking to her.
Peggy, can I borrow a coffee cup? I need a second mug because I got a lady friend now.
Oh, sweet, sweet Bill. So when Boomhower starts hooking up with this woman, you'd think the episode would continue down the Bill road, but it actually takes a Boomhower detour. It subverts our expectations and ends up being a story about Boomhower's heart getting broken. But the friend that he is, Bill gives Boomhower the pep talk of a lifetime. And it's both incredibly emotional and pretty revealing.
Look at me, Boomhower. I'm fat, and I'm old, and every day I'm just gonna wake up fatter and older.
I always found this really interesting. This whole speech basically showcases that Bill is acutely aware of how sad and pathetic he is. He isn't oblivious to his own shortcomings. He really truly gets it. But he also never gives up. He never stops fighting, and he never stops believing that he can find happiness. And he uses this fact to hype up Boomhower and let him know just how possible it is to overcome heartbreak.
I'm out there digging holes, falling into them, climbing out, trying again.
This is probably my favorite Bill Dauterive scene in all of King of the Hill. It's so genuine and comes straight from his own experience with heartbreak, and it showcases his willingness to explore the depths of his own pain in order to help his friends. It highlights everything that makes up Bill's Bill's character in a positive way, and you really love to see that. I think in the end, Bill's selfless nature actually stems from somewhere specific. It's his desire to be needed. When Lenore left him, he felt completely abandoned, like the person he cared most about in the world did not need or want him anymore. And the thing that so many of these instances of Bill's selflessness have in common is that Bill relishes in the feeling of being needed. When he spent all of his money on Leanne, when he helped nurse the Hills back to health, when Boomhower was a sobbing mess and couldn't drag himself out of bed, Bill came along and he gave up his time and his own well-being to put others before him. I guess you could see this as kind of a sad reason to be selfless, but it also makes Bill happy. I have a hard time hating on a guy who gets happiness out of helping people. So here's to William Fontaine de la Tour Dauterive, the most selfless guy in Arlen, Texas. King of the Hill has countless fun and memorable characters, but I don't think any are quite as polarizing as Peggy Hill. This is honestly very understandable given some of her more outrageous escapades, but despite some of her stubborn, self-centered tendencies, I think Peggy is an incredibly nuanced and interesting character. So let's explore exactly what makes Peggy Hill tick.
Oh yeah!
I'm going to start by breaking down the character traits that I think Peggy conveys, and there are a lot. She is very capable, she's loving and passionate, especially towards her family and loved ones. She's a little repressed and naive. She was the last to realize Nancy was cheating on Dale with John Redcorn. She's also ridiculously stubborn and insecure about a lot of aspects of herself. But above all, despite her insecurities, she's incredibly confident, bordering on narcissistic. As Hank said,
Peggy, you've got a pretty high opinion of yourself.
She thinks she's fluent in Spanish, which she absolutely is not.
Benito, pásame sus testes.
This was how she felt about the very first song she ever wrote.
You know, I had a feeling it was very, very good.
She believes she's a genius after taking an online IQ test, but she also has real reasons to be confident about some things. She's a multiple-year winner of the Substitute Teacher of the Year award, she's an actual Boggle State champion, and over the course of the series, she's held a wide variety of jobs that she's shown to be pretty darn good at. But despite her capability, that borderline narcissism is definitely what makes people love to hate Peggy, especially given the ridiculous hijinks that her overconfidence has gotten her into. I mean, let's just briefly break down some of the most ridiculous incidents. She unknowingly became a drug mule for a prisoner. She accidentally became a foot fetish model. She mistakenly kidnapped a Mexican child from Mexico on a class field trip. She punched Randy Travis and accused him of stealing her song, which, to be fair, he did steal her song. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Peggy has gotten into some truly outrageous situations, and they almost always stem from her stubbornness and inability to back down from any sort of challenge or questioning of her capabilities. While it's easy to look at Peggy from the outside in and point out her obvious flaws, from a character perspective, there's actually a really well-rounded explanation for this perpetual cycle that we see Peggy go through. So let me break it down for you, because I think I've got Peggy Hill pegged.
I will not be a failure. Or look like one.
1. Peggy Hill is a capable person and always has been. Throughout the series, despite her shortcomings, she has repeatedly shown that she is smart, crafty, and capable in a great variety of situations. Many of the insane scenarios she's gotten caught up in, she has found her own way out of. 2. For Peggy's entire life, her capabilities have been questioned and undermined. In the season 2 episode Bobby Slam, we get a handful of flashbacks to Peggy's childhood. We see that while growing up, she repeatedly showed that she was very talented in ways that were traditionally not considered very ladylike. And because of these gender norms, she was repeatedly shut down from being able to participate in or fully explore those aspects of herself. We later learn that Peggy's mother seemed to treat her similarly growing up. There's a lot of resentment there. 3. Because of the way Peggy was shut down throughout her entire life, she became deeply insecure about many aspects of herself. She was barred from doing the things that she excelled at and forced to try and do the quote ladylike things that were pushed onto her as a kid, which she wasn't particularly good at. 4. As Peggy got older, she recognized that she really was capable in a lot of different ways that she was repeatedly barred from growing up. This seemingly helped push that stubborn nature to the forefront. Peggy has shown over and over that she hates being told no. She hates being told what she can or can't do, and this is likely because she was told no so much growing up, even when she was capable. 5. This combination of capability, insecurity, and stubbornness became a dangerous combination for Peggy, because though she is capable, she is not capable at everything. There is a lot that she is simply bad at. But because people told her no so much growing up, and she later proved some of these were things she was actually good at, this instilled an overconfidence in her. Basically, when you tell Peggy Hill she can't do something, she's like,
it became personal with me.
6. The insecurity and stubbornness created an inability to admit when she has been beaten or is wrong. Oftentimes, when Peggy is completely overwhelmed by a situation that she was not prepared for, rather than admitting failure, she doubles down and makes things worse. That is pretty much Peggy Hill in a nutshell, the Peggy Hill pattern. There's some occasional variation and twists throughout the series, so let's look at a few examples of how this pattern plays out. In Season 3's Peggy's Pageant Fever, Peggy decides to enter a beauty pageant, which is obviously very representative of those aforementioned ladylike things that Peggy has never been particularly good at. So this once again appeals to her insecurities. She decides to enter to prove herself, and she really believes she's going to win.
With my smarts and looks and muchos talentos, well, I think I have a huge edge over these bimbos, huh, Hank?
When she's challenged by Hank and Nancy, she once again doubles down. She fires Luanne as her stylist and hires a professional to give her an over-the-top makeover, which ultimately dooms her. In the end, Peggy didn't win the pageant or even participate, but this is a pretty solid showcase of that Peggy Hill pattern. In the episode Death in Texas, Peggy receives a letter from a prison inmate who claims that Peggy was a teacher who inspired him. So right off the bat, this person is appealing to Peggy's insecurities. She goes to see him because she wants to believe that she impacts her students in profound ways, even if that student is in jail for murder. Through their time together, Peggy is manipulated by the inmate and begins to spend a lot of time with him, at which point Hank forbids Peggy from going back to the prison. This is where that Peggy Hill stubbornness kicks in.
Nobody forbids Peggy Hill.
Forbidding Peggy Hill is basically the one way you can ensure she'll actually do something. When she doubles down, she's tricked into smuggling cocaine into the prison inside a boggle hourglass. And then, astoundingly, she continues to do it over and over, despite how obvious it is. Peggy's insecurities led her to the prison, and her stubbornness kept her there, getting her into deeper and deeper trouble. But Peggy isn't always this foolish. She does find her own way out of the situation. When she realizes that the inmate used all of the cocaine and there was no evidence against her, she denies any of it happened. We see this pattern over and over. Peggy gets a job at the local newspaper writing the household tips column, something she isn't very good at. When she runs out of tips that she gets from Min, her overconfidence leads her to make up her own, telling people to mix bleach and ammonia for household cleaning. She basically almost mustard gases the entire town. In season 4, she accidentally becomes a foot fetish model, which honestly, there's nothing wrong with, get your money girl, but she didn't realize what she was actually getting into. When Hank shows her the true nature of the foot modeling, she doubles down and continues to model. She's basically convinced that her incredibly large feet are very desirable for certain types of people, which is true, and speaks to Peggy's insecurities directly. She's never felt beautiful or desired, so having something special about her, especially something she was previously very self-conscious of, is exactly what Peggy wanted to hear. In the end, I actually think Peggy probably should be proud of her big feet and not feel insecure about them, but ultimately she felt used and taken advantage of, which is fair given the circumstances. Alright, now let's explore a little Peggy Hill theory that's floated around the internet for a couple decades and involves the evolution of Peggy's narcissism in relation to some specific events in the show. In season 3's finale and season 4's premiere, Hank and Peggy go skydiving for their wedding anniversary. Neither Peggy's parachute or backup chute deploy, and Peggy plunges to the ground from the airplane, ending season 3 on a major cliffhanger. In the season 4 premiere, we find out that she did in fact survive the fall by falling into a very squishy and muddy field, but she breaks every bone in her body. The theory regarding this event is that after the fall, Peggy starts to portray even bigger and more bombastic narcissistic tendencies.
I fell 8,000 feet and survived! Woo-hoo-hoo!
And honestly, I think there is a strong case. I'm not sure if in-universe this would be attributed to physical trauma from the fall, or perhaps emotional trauma from her life almost ending, but it does seem like over the course of seasons 4, 5, and 6, Peggy Hill is more self-centered than ever.
You have probably all heard about the suspension of popular shop teacher Mr. Hill, and his disqualification for substitute teacher of the year.
One of the absolute most ridiculous examples of Peggy's narcissism is, well, everything about the episode Peggy's Fanfare, which starts with Peggy receiving a form letter from Randy Travis's lawyer about a song that she sent him. Hank, and basically everyone else, recognize that this was a formal process, but Peggy thinks this is a supportive push for her to continue to pursue songwriting. Peggy's behavior is borderline insane in this episode,
where we will get to meet our favorite country music stars, including my friend Randy Travis.
She basically completely takes over the church trip to a fair where Randy Travis is performing.
Yes, but you did not get a letter from Randy Travis, and I did.
We learn that she called spaghetti and meatballs, well,
Spaghetti and meatballs.
Did she say spaghetti?
And once she meets Randy Travis, she accuses him of stealing her song.
What the?
You stole my song!
and then punches him in the face. Now, Peggy was always a little self-centered, but the behavior in this episode is next level ridiculous. After Peggy assaults Randy Travis, she plans some revenge with Dale, and Peggy and Dale together is never a good combination. When they conspire, bad things happen. They TP Travis's trailer and accidentally push it into a pond without realizing that Randy Travis was inside the trailer. Now, admittedly, based on Randy Travis's behavior in the episode, in all likelihood, he did steal Peggy's song, so her anger is totally warranted. That being said, a lot of her ridiculous actions came before she learned this, and even the ones after were over the top. I mean, this episode had Hank contemplating the idea that Peggy might be willing to hurt or kill Randy Travis. That is just a lot. Another of the most infamous examples is, of course, Season 6's Lupe's Revenge. In this episode, Peggy demands to take over a class field trip to Mexico when their regular teacher is out sick. She, of course, believes she's fluent in Spanish, which is absolutely not true, but even goes so far as to throw away a Spanish-English dictionary that Bobby tries to bring.
Your mother is a Spanish dictionary.
Her Spanish incompetence leads them to a Mexican butcher rather than their planned destination, and overall, this doesn't go horribly. They have a nice time and head back to Texas. The problem comes on the way back when she accidentally shepherds a young Mexican girl onto the bus with the rest of the class.
Yo vivo en México.
Yes, long live Mexico. Now, where are your parents?
She then hides her at home and tries to figure out how to get her back to Mexico.
Peggy, there's a little Mexican girl in the utility closet.
Peggy does successfully smuggle the girl back to Mexico, but is immediately arrested and tried for her crime. The very funny but depressing way she gets out of this one is taking the stand and talking to the court in Spanish, which makes it abundantly clear that she cannot speak Spanish.
Su pudor. Yo poder ver que usted ser caballo razonable.
Now, I think what makes these two episodes kind of a bummer is the fact that Peggy doesn't get any sort of win in the end.
No es culpable.
Oh my God! I'm going to jail!
He said you're not guilty.
Oftentimes, Peggy overcomes her own mistakes, but in these, she sort of just fumbles her way out of trouble without any sort of positive ending for her as a character. But after Lupe's Revenge, it seems like the writers reeled her back in and gave Peggy a little more competence. One of my favorite Peggy episodes is Season 6's The Substitute Spanish Prisoner, in which Peggy buys into a scam that convinces her she's a genius and one of Texas's smartest people. Also, a killer guest performance from Jeff Goldblum.
It's such a pleasure and an honor and a little intimidating, I must say, to be standing here before you.
This episode once again showcases the classic Peggy Hill pattern. Peggy feels insecure about her intelligence, takes an online IQ test that says she's a genius, and then is offered a membership to an exclusive geniuses club that validates her self-confidence. While there, she's swindled into spending $1,000 on an online PhD program, which obviously isn't real. But what I love about this episode is that it plays off of this Peggy Hill pattern and shows that even she recognizes it sometimes. She formulates a con to try and win back their money from the man who scammed them. We'll just call him Jeff Goldblum. Normally, this would be an example of Peggy doubling down, which often leads to bigger failure. She and everyone who is scammed go in on the con with another $1,000 each, and at first, the episode plays out like we would expect it to. Jeff Goldblum sees through the fake horse racing con, bails before he loses all of his money, and takes off with everyone else's money. But the genius of this episode is that Peggy actually anticipated this, and anticipated that Hank would try to come to her rescue. She installed a fake room safe in Goldblum's room, he stashes the money when Hank comes after him, and they steal the safe through the wall of the hotel. Peggy even had a backup plan to steal Goldblum's car with a fake valet.
Oh, you were gonna steal his car. That would have been a felony.
So this episode represents everything I love about Peggy Hill on this show. We get to experience that typical pattern where she's duped into doing something foolish, and we also get to see her resiliently crawl out of the hole she dug for herself and come out on top. And throughout the rest of the series, Peggy's competence shines through more often than not. In Beer and Loathing, Peggy starts working for Alamo Beer and learns that some of the beer they shipped down to Mexico was contaminated, making consumers super sick. Peggy switches out the owner's beer with some from Mexico, making him sick and forcing him to admit they shipped contaminated beer. In Arlen City Bomber, Peggy rallies her fellow roller derby girls to buy their team out from under their shady owner. In Glen Ross, Peggy secures herself a job with Sizemore Realty, even after initially being fired. Peggy gets herself out of a multi-level marketing scheme that she was swindled into taking over by faking her own death and helping the representative above her get out of it as well. Ultimately, it's why I think that Peggy is such a great character. Despite her obvious shortcomings and ridiculous tendencies to dig her own grave, she is resilient resilient and resourceful enough to dig her own way out, even though her stubborn overconfidence and drive to silence the naysayers get her into a lot of trouble. I think it's an admirable quality. In the end, while we can all cringe at a lot of the decisions that Peggy makes, we also have to acknowledge that she is a strong and capable person who has had to overcome a lot in her life, and through it all, she's maintained a loving home and family, excelled at multiple jobs, including as Substitute Teacher of the Year, and hell, she even wrote a hit song that was stolen by Randy Travis. Honestly, I think Peggy Hill herself said it best.
That makes the score Peggy Hill 1, and people who doubt Peggy Hill 0.
So when I started researching this video, the plan was to talk about one of my favorite characters of all time, Bobby Hill. But the more Bobby-centric episodes I watched, the more I realized that you can't truly get to the root of his character without talking about his father, Hank Hill. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the most important aspect of King of the Hill is Hank and Bobby's relationship. Now, obviously King of the Hill is about a lot of things, but I think that at its core, it's about a father and son who want to understand each other, who want to relate to each other. They are such different people. I mean, one of Hank's literal catchphrases illustrates this.
That boy ain't right.
In spite of this, there are dozens of stories in which Hank and Bobby both make great efforts to connect with each other to find some kind of common ground. But That Boy Ain't Right represents more than just the differences between Hank and Bobby. It represents Hank's entire worldview. The reason that Hank becomes so deeply uncomfortable when Bobby does something that he doesn't understand or perceives as abnormal can also be traced back to the way that he himself was raised. So with that, let's take a deep dive and look at the true heart of King of the Hill, Hank and Bobby.
Why are you always trying to turn me into you? Why can't you accept me for who I am?
Alright, first let's talk a little bit about how Hank was raised. Now this won't be a full dissection of his father, KotH Hill, because frankly, I'll probably do an entire video on him at some point, but in order to understand Hank's worldview, you have to look at how KotH treated him his entire life.
You've been babying him ever since he was a baby.
KotH basically feels an intense resentment towards Hank. Without getting too deep into the weeds on details, KotH associates Hank's birth with what he feels is one of his greatest failures in his life, the failure to assassinate Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. It's hard to say that without laughing. Obviously, Hank himself didn't actually have anything to do with this. Where and when he was born isn't Hank's fault. But even so, this created a resentment towards Hank that literally never ended, up till KotH's death. But more importantly, it informed the way KotH raised Hank. KotH belittled Hank endlessly, never even giving him a chance to succeed. We see this firsthand through flashbacks.
You're never gonna be a war hero like me if you shoot like that. No wonder that kid from the playground stole your pail.
And the trauma from these events deeply rooted itself in Hank at a young age, to the point where it would resurface in adulthood. Heck, sometimes it didn't need to resurface because KotH would just straight up repeat the behavior to his adult son.
Accuracy? Better hope that target's the side of a barn.
KotH wouldn't even consider letting Hank enroll in his boot camp alma mater, and refused to let him set foot on its grounds even when he was an adult, when Bobby was enrolling. Sadly, the way KotH raised Hank informed the way Hank would view his own son while raising him. And this, combined with the societal norms that were also deeply entrenched in Hank, created a real disconnect between himself and his son.
Don't smile, son. You're a working man.
Hank's discomfort towards anything he doesn't understand is so apparent in his relationship with Bobby, and Hank's natural reaction to these things is to get upset and reject them. He thinks Bobby should be normal.
He didn't make a single dumb joke. He was just regular.
Hank is a very stern and straight-laced person. He completely represses certain emotions in so many aspects of his life.
You know, I don't think I've ever seen you guys kiss.
Your father has kissed me.
Peggy!
But the times where Hank's emotions actually break through that repression so often involve Bobby. And these are for sure my favorite moments in the series. Like, between the gut-busting laughs, this is the stuff that gets me emotional with the show. While they aren't the only examples, there are generally a few formulas in episodes that revolve around Hank and Bobby. The first goes like this. Bobby gains an interest in something that Hank is also interested in, or at least something he respects. Bobby somehow disappoints Hank while pursuing that interest, and then in the end, they find a way to bond over it. There are some great episodes that follow this formula, like in What Makes Bobby Run, when Bobby becomes the school mascot. Hank is absolutely overjoyed that Bobby is part of a football tradition.
So you're not
prancing around the garage at all, you're training.
But when Bobby bails on the traditional mascot pummeling, Hank is obviously deeply embarrassed. In the end, Bobby makes up for it with a daring heist of the opposing team's mascot and happily accepts the pummeling from the football team.
Bobby just started a new tradition.
Or the miseducation of Bobby Hill when Bobby actually takes an interest in selling propane, something that normally Hank would be completely ecstatic about. But Hank is not stoked when Bobby starts to use cheap sales tactics to help sell grills. Hank is a man of integrity, and Bobby ends up with a whole mess of upset customers because he didn't do his due diligence. Hank, of course, sweeps in to save the day with his impeccable customer service. I love this one because not only does Hank show a real confidence in Bobby to work in propane,
the great ones practice the basics.
So, you thought I could be a great one too?
but Bobby also can't help but gush about his dad's major success. In the end, they both take pride in each other. Another of my absolute favorites is Season 8's Livin' on Reds, Vitamin C, and Propane, when Hank and Bobby rent a semi-truck to deliver some furniture to Hank's mom. Bobby is just so excited that he and his dad are truckers, and Hank is fulfilling a real dream of his as well, while also connecting with his son over something he loves. But when they get called out by real truckers, they're both brought down to earth a little bit.
I thought you said we were truckers.
We are.
I don't mean to spoil your fun, sir, but you're not a trucker. You're just a guy with a truck.
This is such a well-executed moment because obviously both of them are disappointed for not being considered real truckers, but for Hank, it's a lot more than that. Not only was his dream of being a real trucker dashed, but he let down his son in the process. It's a double whammy. Hank was fulfilling two dreams and they both came crashing down at once. A genuine connection with Bobby was taken away. Also, Dale, Bill, and Boomhower stow away in the back of the truck, which leads to one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Later, Hank nearly falls asleep at the wheel, so Bobby decides to let him sleep in the cab and to have the other guys keep on trucking through the night to make it on schedule, which ends up stranding them on the top of a mountain. Hank leads them on a daring retreat down the mountain that ultimately earns the respect of the truckers they meet at the next stop. In this one, Bobby did have a pretty major mess up in getting them stranded on that mountain, but the mistake led to them doing something incredible that earned them true respect. Bobby and Hank were real truckers, and Hank even fulfilled another dream.
You mean like a convoy?
Damn straight.
God, that's a good episode. You just rewatch that one. It's great. Another common formula we see for these Hank and Bobby stories go like this. Bobby will gain an interest in something that deeply upsets Hank, and then one of two things happen. One, Bobby will actually come to learn from Hank's point of view and see why it upset him, or two, Hank will grow to understand something new about that hobby that he respects, which of course gives him more respect for Bobby. There are a handful of episodes where we see Bobby really learn from Hank's point of view, like when he saves him from drinking dog's blood in The Witches of East Arland.
Me? Drink dog blood? That's not my thing.
Or when he rescues him from a really uncomfortable situation at a co-ed slumber party and Get Your Freak Off.
Oh, thank God.
I think my favorite is in Fish and Wildlife. Hank wants to teach Bobby how to be self-reliant and catch his own food, but instead Bobby gets involved with some real shady hippies who end up stealing Hank's fishing gear and truck. Obviously, Bobby learns a harsh lesson because he feels awful about the trouble he caused, but the best moment comes at the very end. Hank asks Bobby if he's ready to go home after their long ordeal.
Ready to go home?
Not yet, Dad. We still gotta pick up dinner.
These moments are what the show is all about, and honestly where this relationship really shines. But honestly, the times when Hank learns from Bobby are what really makes the relationship work for me. Bobby is a kid, so he should be learning from his father, but Hank is a very stubborn man, and when his own son is able to expand his worldview, it's always really satisfying. And most importantly, it always helps Hank discover a new way to love and appreciate Bobby, which really fills my heart. Some of the best episodes of the series showcase this dynamic. Like in Life in the Fast Lane, Bobby's Saga, when Bobby gets a job working for Jimmy Witchard at the racetrack. It's incredibly clear that Jimmy is a dangerous, awful boss, and Bobby wants to quit, but Hank thinks Bobby is just trying to get out of working. But when he finally recognizes that Bobby wasn't just trying to be lazy, and that Jimmy was genuinely putting his son in danger, he completely snaps. Sometimes it takes a rude awakening for Hank to shift his worldview. Another incredible episode is Goodbye Normal Jeans, when Bobby shows a real impressive knack for home ec class. At first, Hank's gender-normative worldview sees a real issue with this. He considers it women's work. But once Hank realizes just how impressive Bobby is at this stuff, he changes his tune. In fact, Hank is so supportive that he wants Bobby to make the entire Thanksgiving meal. There are so many great moments between the two of them in this episode. I really love it.
Bobby and I were up all night talking. Really talking.
But I think there's one episode that really shows what I'm talking about here perfectly. Meet the Propaniacs is legendary. Hank is obviously someone who genuinely does not understand comedy. Like, try to think of a single moment in King of the Hill where Hank truly and genuinely laughs. There are not many of them. But when Bobby caters his improv skills to a propane-centric audience, it actually gets through to Hank.
I love it. God help me, I love it.
It was so successful that they decided to take the show on the road.
You will be called the Propane Maniacs.
No, the Propaniacs.
Bro, hold up. Look how angry Peggy is here. Oh my god. That's classic. But more importantly, Hank actually gets to connect with his son over propane, and Bobby actually gets to connect with his father over comedy.
Yep, those were some good times. Bobby'd tell me something about comedy, and then I'd teach him a little bit about propane.
It's literally both of their dreams combined. In the end, an unfortunate incident with the Texas Propane Commissioner basically ends the Propaniac's successful run, which puts Hank really down in the dumps.
You didn't think it was funny?
It's not that it's not funny, Bobby. In fact, it's the funniest thing I've ever heard.
To make up for it, they try to get the Propaniacs back together at a local mall off the propane circuit. Obviously, the humor doesn't land with general audiences, but that's not what's important to Bobby. It was always about the connection he was making with his dad.
Oh! Oh!
God, this is such a good moment. Guys, I'm telling you, this is what the show's about. The reason that these incredible moments between Hank and Bobby work is because of what it means for both of them as characters. Hank's relationship with Cotton scarred him for life, but in the end we know that Hank is a much better person and father than Cotton because of this dynamic with Bobby. Hank could have allowed history to repeat itself and push Bobby towards a repressed lifestyle. Even though it's sometimes a long road to get there, the fact that Hank is actually able to admit when he is wrong or accept ideas that he previously rejected shows exactly how he is a great father to Bobby.
And a lot of people think Bobby's funny. The kid's only 13 years old and he's already sold a joke to this Yakov Smirnov.
Even though he struggles to understand Bobby, he is able to shift his perspective and see what things are good and what things are bad for his son, even if he doesn't fully understand them. Cotton never did this for Hank. In fact, the way Cotton treated Hank for his entire life completely destroyed his confidence. Hank had to find his own sense of confidence later in life, from things like playing football, or later propane. In fact, one of the reasons that Hank is so loyal to Buck Strickland, despite his obvious character flaws, is because he's a surrogate father figure. He actually believed in Hank in a way that Cotton never did, and gave him his opportunity in propane. Hank built his literal entire adult life around propane, and I think we can assume that this is at least subconsciously Hank trying to make his father figure proud, something he was never able to do growing up. Ultimately, despite the stumbles and disagreements along the way, Hank always finds a reason to be proud of and support Bobby's most important endeavors, even the ones he initially rejects. And because of this, Bobby is an incredibly confident kid. Even though he's weird and awkward, he's also charming and funny. And the confidence that he's built thanks to that support garners him really great opportunities in life. Bobby Hill knows who he is and he knows what he's good at. When he finds something he's interested in, he dives in head first without caring what the world might think. I mean, by all accounts, Bobby is a funny looking kid, but one absolutely consistent thing throughout the show is that he is pretty successful with women. They don't always end well.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
But you can't deny his confidence. They even juxtapose him with his best friend Joseph, who's a more typical jock, someone you might expect to be more naturally confident in a school setting. But instead, they show just how much Joseph admires Bobby's ability to charm and his natural charisma. In fact, Bobby delivers what I think is one of the most inspiring messages in the entire show.
Mom, I'm fat, but big deal. Just because there are some people in the world who want me to feel bad about it, doesn't mean I have to.
Honestly, this is an attitude that I am so envious of. Bobby knows he doesn't have to let the world or society dictate what he is or isn't. He knows who he is.
So Bobby Hill's fat. Heh, he's also funny. He's nice. He's got a lot of friends. A girlfriend.
This is everything that Hank is not. Hank is so fixated on what the world might think of him. He's so afraid of showing vulnerability, and that's frankly because of the person who raised him. But despite this, Hank raised someone who loves who he is and isn't afraid to be vulnerable. Despite Hank's entire personality being the antithesis of this attitude, when it counts, he supports Bobby despite his own discomfort. That is what makes Hank a great father. He makes the right decisions in spite of himself. It's not Hank's fault he ended up so repressed, but you have to give him credit for being able to push through that repression to help his son succeed. I'm a broken record, but this is what the entire show is all about. Yes, there is a huge cast of incredible, funny, nuanced characters, but the heart and core of the series is Hank and Bobby Hill, and I can prove it. Besides the fact that so many episodes focus on their dynamic, it's which episodes focus on them that's most important. Namely, the pilot, and the series finale. While back in the original pilot the characterizations felt a bit different, there is a clear focus on Bobby and Hank's relationship. In the episode, Hank is investigated by Child Services because of his anger. Bobby gets a black eye playing baseball and they suspect it was Hank. After it's cleared up, they call off the investigation, but Bobby decides not to tell his parents because of the way Hank was treating him.
But I like him better this way.
How come?
I can make him love me even when I screw up.
The very first episode of the show establishes that Bobby doesn't think Hank even really likes him, let alone is proud of him. Hank pushes through this repression to tell Bobby how he really feels about him.
I'm not just a big disappointment to you.
Disappointment? No, you make me proud.
King of the Hill immediately establishes that this is the heart of the series in the very first episode, and then they set it in stone by making the series finale focus on their relationship as well. This final episode, To Sirloin with Love, is entirely about Bobby having a major success story that connects him with Hank, and makes Hank proud. Bobby showcases a real talent for judging meats, and joins a competitive team at the Heimlich County Junior College. But after he realizes that his teammates are into the sport for all the wrong reasons, he quits the team, much to Hank's chagrin.
I'm quitting the team.
What? No, we were so close.
But here's why I think King of the Hill series finale is one of the best and most satisfying out there. When Bobby sees that Hank got him his own grill so that they can grill together, it becomes clear what this was all about for Hank. Why Hank was so upset that Bobby quit the team.
This isn't about you being on a team. It isn't even about beef. What your father cares about is that you two finally have something in common.
Kind of recontextualizes this line, doesn't it?
We were so close.
Like I said, this was always what the show was about. It's Hank and Bobby, despite their differences, trying to relate to each other. And Bobby does the right thing here. He decides to go to the tournament, not because he wants to compete or because he wants to judge meats, but because he wants to make his father proud. He wants to maintain that connection that they have. On top of this, the actual team, including Hank, gets stranded after the opposing team hijacks their bus, and Bobby has to compete in every competition all by himself. And he gets them all the way to the finals. There's this really great moment at the end. The team shuns Bobby when they arrive, but Hank sparks in him the confidence he needs to make the right decision.
Are you sure?
Yes, I am.
Then it's time to speak up.
Bobby jumps in despite his teammates' protest and wins the entire competition. He did literally the entire thing by himself, despite pushback from his teammates. It's one of his most impressive accomplishments across the show. We've seen Bobby do some really impressive things competitively before, like the rifle competition, dog dancing, rose growing, but Bobby didn't place first in those. This time, he won the championship and he did it all on his own. I think one of my favorite moments here is a simple one. Bobby is being hoisted by his teammates, and Hank walks up to him and he shakes his hand. I know you'd expect a father and son to hug, but this is Hank Hill we're talking about. A handshake is the firmest sign of respect he can give you. Hank respects Bobby. This finale is so damn good. The final scene makes me tear up every single time.
Well, Dad, it looks like this is the last one.
Oh, you're just getting started, Bobby. You'll be grilling your whole life.
Just like you.
The show begins with Hank and Bobby struggling to relate to each other, and it ends with them effortlessly coming together and sharing in something they both love. And that, folks, is why Hank and Bobby are the heart of King of the Hill.
Yep.
Yep.
King of the Hill is a show defined by familial relationships. At the heart of the series is Hank, his son Bobby, and their struggles to find connection through their vastly different worldviews. But resting above that relationship is a man named KotH Hill. He killed 50 men, lost his shins in the war, and is the root of a lot of the generational trauma that has been passed down through Hank and Bobby. But despite KotH being an unjustifiably awful father, husband, and human being, his life and general existence is actually pretty tragic. It's fascinating to look at the circumstances surrounding his pain and his resentment, and though it doesn't excuse his behavior, it does paint a nuanced picture of a very sad man. So join me as we look at the tragic life and death of KotH Hill. KotH Hill joined the military during World War II when he was only 14 years old. Over the course of the series, KotH told countless stories about his time in the war, though there are disputes in regards to whether or not every story is fact. Some of the things he claims don't quite line up.
Well, how did my dad fight in Germany and Japan at the same time?
But what we do know is that while fighting in Japan, KotH's shins were basically shot off. His account of this incident is brutal and includes him beating his assailants to death with his own friend's leg.
I woke up in a field hospital, and they were sewing my feet to my knees.
This is obviously the major defining event in KotH's life. He was allegedly 6'4" before he lost his shins and 5 foot even after he lost them. It's easy to see how this could make somebody resentful. His doctor even said he would never be able to walk again, but KotH is nothing if not stubborn.
18 months later, he walked right over to that doctor, reached up, and punched him in the kidneys.
Now, obviously, KotH was raised in a different time, and he had a lot of resentment and trauma built from his experience in World War II, and these things dictated how he treated his son Hank growing up, which is to say, not good. And it didn't help that Hank's birth itself prevented KotH from achieving a major goal of his own, assassinating Cuban dictator Fidel Castro in New York City. So resentment was all too familiar for KotH in nearly every aspect of his life, but in particular for his son Hank.
He was crying the second he popped his head out of his mama.
In fact, the way KotH raised Hank very effectively explains so much about who Hank became as a man. KotH suffered such hardships that he had absolutely no empathy for his son, even when he was a literal child.
I got my shins blown off by a Japan man's machine gun. So don't come crying to me with your problems.
KotH never gave Hank any positive support or encouragement. Hank's failures were met with derision from a very young age.
You're never gonna be a war hero like me if you shoot like that. No wonder that kid from the playground stole your pail.
As he got older, this didn't let up either. In fact, it arguably got worse. KotH outright told Hank to his face what he thought would happen if he had gotten drafted.
Some of you, like Hank, will be killed.
Even through Hank's high school career, KotH would blame him for things that he had absolutely no control over, like when he broke his ankle in the big football game.
This is your fault. And you got them weak ankles from your mommy.
He was a miserably awful father to Hank, and this led Hank to develop into the incredibly repressed man we see in King of the Hill. Any sign of emotion, or weakness as KotH would consider it, is now buried deep inside of Hank. In fact, I think there are maybe only 3 times we see Hank cry over the course of the show. When he thinks Bill dies, when Lady Bird runs away, and when his truck is breaking down, but I can't really think of any others. KotH's attempt at a sex talk for Hank consisted of bringing him to a farm to watch a bull mate with a cow, which likely contributed to Hank's immense sexual repression we see throughout the show as well.
I don't think I've ever seen you guys kiss.
Your father has kissed me.
Peggy!
But KotH's mistreatment of Hank goes even further than his childhood and teenage years. Over the course of the series, we see KotH mistreat Hank on a regular basis, and it often undermines Hank's own life and relationships. In Season 2's premiere, Hank and Bobby are connecting over sport shooting competitions, but Hank initially struggles to find his shot because of his traumatic memories of his father teaching him to use a rifle. Hank eventually works through those issues and does really well in the competition, until KotH shows up, regressing Hank.
I got money riding on this shot. On the McKays.
KotH is persistently questioning Hank's manhood and putting him down, but aside from this, he also refuses to show him even the simplest common courtesy. When Hank was temporarily blinded, KotH wouldn't even let him touch his shoulder to guide him into the house. Late in the series, when KotH is giving up his Cadillac, Hank wants to buy it, partially because he took care of the car his entire life, but also so that he could have something that connects him with his father. A father he feels he has very little connection with. KotH instead decides to give the car away to Hank's cousin Dusty.
Dusty's always been like a son to me.
I'm your son.
Oh yeah, and Hank's cousin Dusty is actually none other than ZZ Top, the famous musician who has countless cars and no need for KotH's Cadillac. KotH even pretends to be sorry about this to Hank later in the episode, but only to create drama for Dusty's reality TV show. And KotH's disrespect for Hank gets even more blatant as well. In one episode, he plays keep away with Hank's gluteal prosthetic, something he needs for his debilitating back pain. In another, he gets Hank drunk, strips him naked, ties him up, and locks him in the Alamo. He relentlessly mistreats his son throughout his entire life, and Hank continues to try and make his father proud, though it does reach a boiling point a few times. In the episode The Father, the Son, and JC, Hank actually pushes back on KotH's mistreatment in one of the most meaningful ways he ever has. Because of KotH's nature, Hank was never comfortable expressing his feelings towards his father, likely because he actually wasn't a quality father figure in his life. But one person who did support Hank in ways that KotH never did was Buck Strickland. Now, Buck is obviously not a perfect father figure either. Hank basically keeps Strickland Propane running and doesn't get the credit he deserves. At least until this episode, when Buck decides to promote him from assistant manager to manager. But Hank's repression and unresolved paternal trauma cause him to blurt out something pretty embarrassing in response.
Mr. Strickland, I love you.
This actually loses Hank the promotion, but interestingly, it also causes jealousy in Cotton, who goes so far as to uninvite his own son from Christmas dinner. This is such an interesting premise because the core of the conflict is so contradictory to how Cotton carries himself and treats Hank. He expects the love and adoration that Hank gives Buck without actually doing any of the legwork to earn it. And this episode even showcases likely the most resentment for Cotton we've ever seen from Hank as well.
I hate the man. Huh. Feels good every time I say it.
In fact, after extensive therapy-like conversations with Jimmy Carter, the absolute closest to reconciliation these two get is admitting that they wouldn't obliterate the other one from existing. They simply agree that they would like to continue to exist in the same world as the other one, and nothing more.
My father said he wouldn't obliterate me? His words?
The level of repression and resentment these two feel for each other is incredibly unhealthy, but it makes for some great TV. In one of the final moments of the episode, Hank and Cotton bond over their shared appreciation for shooting nail guns, and I think that this is probably the closest Cotton will ever come to telling his son he loves him. Which is pretty sad, but this is still a sweet moment.
Boy, I love shooting a nail gun.
I love shooting a nail gun too.
And Cotton's resentment extends beyond Hank as well. Cotton has a habit of expecting people to suffer and experience the same things he has, at least to a degree. I actually showed a clip from the pilot episode earlier that illustrates this. Cotton writes off Hank's scraped knee because he himself lost his shins. He judges Hank's experience against his own and feels it isn't worth feeling any pity over, and he treats a lot of people this way throughout the show. In the episode An Officer and a Gentle Boy, we see it in action. Hank decides Bobby needs some firmer boundaries in his life, and he and Cotton decide to send him to Cotton's old military academy, Fort Burke, to toughen him up. Interestingly, Cotton never even offered Hank the opportunity to go to Fort Burke, despite Hank wishing he could go. Hank wanted so desperately to get his father's approval, but Cotton wasn't even willing to offer an opportunity to impress him. It's another level of resentment. Bobby's time at Fort Burke is different though. The school changed a lot over the years. The punishments and hazing rituals softened significantly. Of course, this doesn't work for Cotton, who suddenly resents the school for not offering the same harsh environment that he himself faced as a kid. So he takes over the school and shapes it back to its former ways. But to Cotton's shock, Bobby is more resilient than anybody could have expected. He handles Cotton's hazing and punishments with ease, including solitary confinement in the hole for 3 days, one entire day longer than Cotton spent there. And on top of it, Bobby is barely even bothered when he emerges. This sort of shakes the foundation of Cotton's worldview, as Bobby's kind and softer nature would, to him, suggest that he would never handle such difficulties. But maybe the way Bobby carries himself actually makes him stronger than the generations that come before. This is really one of the only times that Cotton acknowledges his way might not be the best way, and even so, it's a fleeting moment, because throughout the show, Cotton treats just about everyone he meets with the regressive attitude of his era, particularly the women. There are smaller instances, like how after Luanne fixes Cotton's car, he scoffs at the very idea that she could have done this sort of quote-unquote man's work.
That's like a pig trying to read.
Pig?
Or when Reverend Stroop starts to work in Arlen for the first time, and he immediately starts to recite from memory all of the verses of the Bible that suggest she shouldn't be able to preach.
Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. Corinthians.
And then there's of course the way he treats his own wife, Dee Dee. He basically uses her as a live-in maid to do his bidding, and of course rub his legs with shin jelly. In fact, when the family was in dire straits financially, Cotton left Dee Dee because she tried to work for herself to support them. It's a real deep-seated resentment stemming from the time in which he was raised, and that stubbornness harms himself along with his loved ones. Cotton wasn't even around when Dee Dee gave birth to his son GH. Bobby drove Dee Dee to the hospital and cut the umbilical cord. Hell, Bobby basically was the only one taking care of the kid for the first week out of the hospital. Cotton did nothing to support his wife, who was experiencing extreme postpartum depression. Though I think perhaps the most interesting relationship in regards to Cotton's backwards views on women is none other than Peggy Hill, or Hank's wife as he refers to her. I actually don't think there's a single time where Cotton calls her Peggy. It's always Hank's wife, which is pretty representative of the way he views women in relation to men. To Cotton, Peggy only has value as Hank's wife, not as her own person. And any problems with the Hill household, those are Peggy's fault, not Hank's.
Hank, your wife let the salt run out. Flour, sugar, dog food, soda pop.
The first real appearance of Cotton in season 1 pretty much revolves around this. Cotton effectively forces his way into staying with Hank and Peggy. Peggy immediately objects and doesn't want him staying with them, pointing out how awful his behavior is and suggesting it's not good for Bobby to see that. But Hank, constantly seeking his father's approval, makes excuses for Cotton and ignores Peggy.
You just cannot see your father for who he is.
And sure enough, Cotton's awful behavior rubs off on Bobby in the worst ways. But when Hank tries to confront Cotton, he tells him his pitiable sob story about his shins to try and weasel out of any sort of confrontation or accountability, which of course works on Hank, who, as we've established, has a very broken relationship to his father. But it comes to a head when Bobby starts a sexist riot at school.
That's woman's work. Ain't that right, fellas? Women's work. Women's work.
Fortunately, while Hank is repressed and has some stubborn viewpoints, he's a good and decent man who ultimately loves and supports his wife. And he knows that Cotton's worldview and behavior isn't acceptable.
And I won't let him grow up to be a woman-hating old fool. No wonder Mom left you. She was a strong lady, classy and smart like Peg.
Now, I've talked a lot about Peggy, and we all know that she's got some very frustrating personality traits, but I think it's undeniable that through all of the abuse she suffered from Cotton, she seemed to grow to understand him better than almost anyone else.
This is about a man who, for 50 years, denied any human emotion so he could hide from his haunting memories of war, ruining his relationship with his son.
Peggy and Cotton almost had a symbiotic antagonistic relationship with one another, as though their resentment for one another also fueled them. After Peggy broke all her bones in that skydiving accident, she struggled immensely with her physical therapy, but it was actually Cotton who motivated her and helped her regain her strength. Cotton was able to use his boot camp-like tactics to continue to berate and abuse Peggy. That abuse was the fuel Peggy needed to try and succeed in spite of Cotton, and it worked. I would say that this was the closest Peggy and Cotton ever came to an actual functioning relationship, nearly a friendship even.
Cotton, may I have this dance?
This, of course, wasn't a lasting bond, but I do think their rivalry was incredibly important to the series, which to me is pretty explicitly proven by her role in Cotton's final episode, Death Picks Cotton, but we'll get there soon. And outside of this, there were just countless ways that Cotton mistreated Peggy throughout the series, sometimes even suggesting horrific things.
Remember, under no circumstances is the wife allowed in my Cadillac car. Unless she's in a bag in the trunk.
But Cotton's stubborn, ancient, and outdated views do sort of get to the core of the tragedy of Cotton's life, because though his actions are inexcusable and unjustifiable, they do stem from his own tragic past. Cotton's repressed trauma and archaic worldview, combined with the fact that society tends to overlook and disrespect both veterans and the disabled, led to an existence where Cotton feels incredibly disrespected, but still incapable of any meaningful change. Cotton is so stubborn about his own worldview, and we see this in the way that he treats his son, his wife, all women, and people in general. And because his worldview is outright offensive to modern society, he is in turn met with disrespect, oftentimes deservedly, but not always. In the episode when Cotton comes marching home, he and Dee Dee are in financial crisis. The bank even repossesses their house. Cotton is forced to get a job and becomes a greeter at a restaurant, but now sitting low on the totem pole in a service industry position, Cotton isn't treated with any semblance of respect.
Whoa, what are you doing?
He was waiting, I'm showing him to a table.
That's the hostess's job. You're a greeter. Now please return to your stool.
Eventually, this disrespect sends Cotton off the deep end when he's told he can't get work off to march in the Veterans Day parade, which to me is really messed up. Cotton doesn't show others much respect, but I'm definitely not cheering for a corporation to take advantage of an old man. And conversely, Cotton is shown to be most happy when he is being treated with respect, even when it's undue, or false respect. In the episode Dale Tech, Cotton starts to stay with Hank, but the family basically doesn't have the time to keep an eye on him, so they put him in an elderly daycare facility. This dashes his spirits pretty significantly, and after he throws a tantrum, the police are called, and he's actually given more respect by the police officers. They even make him an honorary officer to watch over Hank's neighborhood. Now, given his behavior, I definitely don't think Cotton was owed this level of respect, especially given how quickly he abuses his newly perceived power. While trying to solve a mystery for Hank, he nearly whips Bobby and Peggy. Like literally, with a real whip. To his credit, Cotton does eventually solve Hank's mystery for him, but it's fascinating how quickly he abuses his power. The man will do concerning things when he feels he's being treated with high levels of adoration. This actually comes into play in a big way in Death Buys a Timeshare, when Cotton, Bill, and Hank vacation to Mexico to attend a timeshare presentation. The goal is to get a free vacation by refusing to buy the timeshare. Unfortunately, because these timeshare folks are just salesmen trying to get on their customers' good good side, they show Cotton an incredibly high degree of respect. He's basically treated like a king, given the nicest sweets, invited to exclusive parties, and of course, as Cotton has barely shown respect in his everyday life, he takes to it immediately, and he buys a timeshare.
Colonel, I wasn't supposed to tell you this because you're not an owner yet, but you've already been handpicked by O'Kelly to join his El Presidente circle.
Hank actually comes through for Cotton in a pretty nice way in this episode. The timeshare folks realize that Cotton doesn't have any assets for them to leverage, so they don't sell him a timeshare, but Hank sees how much it means to him.
Since all my buddies kicked off, things just ain't felt right. But now I got me someplace where I belong.
In order to let Cotton spend time at these fancy parties that actually make him feel happy, Hank buys the timeshare himself, a truly selfless act for a man who did not really deserve it. While Cotton is a sad, horrible man, there were those occasional glimpses of humanity in him. However brief, the man definitely loved his grandson Bobby.
But you know, even though he hates most things, he does love Bobby.
Ow!
In fact, he even makes a pretty huge sacrifice for Bobby in Revenge of the Lutefisk. A series of events where Bobby eats all of Reverend Stroop's lutefisk leads to him accidentally setting fire to the entire church, but Cotton ends up being falsely accused of the crime. When Bobby eventually comes clean about the incident, Cotton actually decides he will take the fall because he doesn't want to see Bobby punished for his mistake. This is probably the one truly selfless thing we've ever seen Cotton do, and it's nice that even beneath his awful behavior, there is still love, even if it barely ever shines through. This, of course, does not excuse his excessively awful behavior throughout the series, and to suggest Cotton is actually a good person because of his few truly human moments would be a ludicrous argument to make, but it still gives us some great, genuine, heartfelt moments in the show. And those moments do go a really long way to tug at the heartstrings, even when they're facilitated through Cotton's selfishness. In season 3, Hank and Peggy are trying to get pregnant and have another child, but because of Hank's narrow urethra, they're struggling immensely. Meanwhile, Cotton and Dee Dee get pregnant on accident, which obviously upsets Peggy. But Cotton becomes overwhelmed by the thought of raising a child at his age, and simultaneously actually shows genuine sadness over Hank and Peggy's pregnancy struggles.
Your daddy's the right age to be having babies. Poor Hank and Hank's wife. They want another baby real bad.
Of course, Cotton's solution is still a selfish one. He runs away, abandoning his responsibility as the child's father, and in his mind, gifting his son a child. But obviously, he's really just thrusting the responsibility onto Hank. This leads to probably my favorite Cotton and Hank moment in the entire show, as Hank and Cotton lament their own pregnancy problems.
Hell, if it's a contest on who's the better daddy, you win. I mean, you made Bobby. All I made was you.
It's so impressive how the show is able to give us these scenes that feel like real moments of love and connection between Hank and Cotton, while still allowing Cotton to undercut it with a jab at Hank. Vintage Cotton, truly. And all things considered, it does seem like Cotton improved slightly as a father when raising his next son, Good Hank, or GH for short. I mean, it's wild how even just naming his newborn son was a slight at Hank. But we do see evidence that Cotton was trying harder with GH than he did with Hank. We see that he's got countless home videos of GH that he's taken himself, showing much more care and attention than he did to Hank. At the end of When Cotton Comes Marching Home, he even accepts Hank's financial help for GH's sake.
Hank, I thought it over. I've decided to let you give me some money. You know, for GH.
This is actually one of the biggest instances we've seen of Cotton growing past his own hangups. He wouldn't accept help initially because he feels it's his responsibility to provide for his family, and not doing so makes him feel like less of a man. But by accepting Hank's help, he looks beyond his own self-esteem and does the best thing for his child. It's a great moment. But despite these occasional examples of Cotton's growth, his repressed trauma would ultimately follow him to his death. In Cotton's final episode, his PTSD triggers a violent response at a Benihana type restaurant. Cotton ends up breaking bones and badly burning himself on this giant grill, and the doctors give him very little time to live. I think the saddest thing about this episode is the way that Cotton continues to berate and belittle Hank until his literal death. Hank tries so hard to reconcile and make amends with his father, but Cotton wouldn't have it.
I love you too, Dad.
You loves me?
Dad?
What kind of man tells another man he loves him? I don't want to die with my sissy son who loves me.
After this exchange, it looks like Cotton dies, and afterwards Hank fully blames himself. He even claims that he picked a fight with Cotton on his deathbed, which obviously is not what happened. The man just tried to reconcile his complicated feelings with his father. Even while dying, Cotton undermines Hank's well-being. I mean, he requests arguably the most insane thing anyone has ever requested on their deathbed.
I want you to cut off my head and mail it to the Japanese emperor.
Hank tries desperately for the entire rest of the episode to tell his father he loves him. It's kinda sad to watch. It's Hank's last chance to connect with the father who he has desperately sought the approval of his entire life, approval he has never been given, and instead of any type of closure, he's chastised.
I couldn't stand the torture of hearing your baby crying about your daddy dying.
Honestly, one of my favorite moments in all of King of the Hill is Cotton's death, because it so perfectly encapsulates so many important aspects of the series. On his deathbed, Peggy confronts Cotton and chews him out for the way he treated Hank his entire life. Even when Cotton is berating Peggy, she instead defends the man she loves. But it also shows that Peggy, as I claimed earlier, truly understands Cotton. She knew exactly what Cotton needed to hear.
I hope you do go on living forever as the unhappy person you are in the hell you have created here on Earth.
I mentioned that symbiotic antagonistic relationship between these two earlier, and I think this illustrates it perfectly. The man literally wasn't able to die until he found peace through defying this person who he hated most.
I hope you live forever. I really do.
Do you now?
Cotton died the way he lived, defiant, angry, without showing any sort of affection for his son, and all while berating Peggy. But you know Cotton's impact on Hank wasn't going to end with his death, because there's one last episode that really grapples with Cotton's legacy and the shadow his life cast over Hank's. In the final season, Hank is tasked with handling Cotton's will. Hank sees this as his last chance to find meaning in his relationship with his father.
Even dead, Cotton will always find a way to disrupt our lives.
It leads him and his friends on a wild scavenger hunt to ultimately flush Cotton's ashes down General S. Patton's toilet. And while Hank doesn't actually find connection with his father through this misadventure, he does realize that the people Cotton did connect with were his friends, the friends who had also since passed on. And through this realization, he sees the value in the friendships that he has made, and the length that those friends go to help him. And I think this was actually the absolute perfect way to end Hank's saga with Cotton. Because ultimately, though Cotton was an awful father who never gave Hank the love or respect he deserved, Hank was a stronger man, and he was able to achieve a better, more fulfilling life in spite of his father. Hank has a loving wife, an amazing son, and an incredible group of friends, and he did that without the help of Cotton Hill. Hell, he did it while actively fighting against the trauma inflicted on him by Cotton Hill. And this final story represents that beautifully, as Hank learns an important life lesson while dealing with his father's extreme expectations. The ultimate irony is that Cotton was always ashamed of Hank, but Hank was actually one of the only genuine accomplishments in Cotton's life. One of the only good things to come from his legacy. Cotton Hill's life was tragic, but not because he's just a sad or sympathetic figure. His history is heartbreaking for sure, but his life is tragic because his stubbornness created his own personal hell, and the people around him were swept up in it. He's tragic because he made his son's life miserable. He's tragic because he treated people horribly. He's tragic because he was constantly angry and defiant and made people's lives incredibly difficult. In the episode Returning Japanese, Hank has this dreamlike vision in a sweat lodge, and he envisions the one moment he always hoped he could have with his own father.
I waited your whole life to tell you this, boy. You're a good son. And I'm switching to propane.
Thank you, Dad.
All Hank ever wanted was the respect of his dad and a genuine handshake. And would you believe it if I told you that one of the final moments in King of the Hill reflects this? In the very final episode, in one of the final scenes, Hank recognizes something he respects in his own son, Bobby. But instead of reject it or repress it, he embraces it. And he lets Bobby know it, giving him a true and genuine handshake, made even more beautiful with the added context of his father, Cotton.
Dale Gribble, or should I say Rusty Shackelford, one of, if not the funniest character in all of King of the Hill. Alright, I'm gonna be honest with y'all, I watched like 20 Dale-centric episodes expecting to have some kind of revelatory take on the character, but truthfully, what you see with Dale is kinda what you get.
Pocket sand.
I think he is inarguably one of the stupidest characters on the show, but in like a weirdly charming way. Dale's stupidity is so off-the-wall ridiculous that it's hard to judge him in the same way as someone like, say, Bill or Luanne. The comedic spin on Dale's stupidity is that he overthinks things in such a conspiratorial way that he completely looks past the obvious truths in front of him. I mean, look at his family life. But seeing just how far Dale is willing to take and believe in some of these conspiracies is what makes his character so damn funny. And it also makes those rare occasions where he's actually right all the more satisfying. And while the easy thing to do is look at Dale and say, wow, this man's delusions are a genuine danger to his family and society as a whole, there are some positive traits we can break down. So let's take a deep dive and get to know everyone's favorite crazy neighbor, Dale Gribble.
You don't know me. I am unknowable.
Let's start with some positives about Dale, because as much as I hate to say it, there are not that many. But, weirdly, despite his complete skepticism of almost any and every institution that exists, in his personal life, Dale is surprisingly loyal and trusting. I mean, we know exactly how trusting he is when it comes to his wife and her healing sessions with John Redcorn.
Now get inside and start massaging my wife.
Dale loves and supports his wife and son in all of their endeavors and completely trusts Nancy. Dale is also pretty loyal to his friends, although he does expect the same in return. In Season 1's King of the Anthill, we see Dale defend Hank from Khan's belittling of Hank's lawn, and at his own expense too.
If anyone's bringing down the value of this neighborhood, it's me.
But when Hank fires Dale from spraying his brand new lawn, Dale extracts revenge brutally and quickly by releasing fire ants into Hank's yard. And this wasn't just any old lawn.
It's Raleigh St. Augustine.
This was a pretty mean thing to do to a friend, especially a friend who cares so much about his lawn. But Dale did feel betrayed by Hank, and maybe rightfully so. Though later in the series, Hank's frustration towards Dale is even more deserved, and Dale doubles and triples down on being a bad friend. In the Texas skill saw massacre, Hank falls through the floor of his kitchen to reveal a tunnel that Dale dug under his house.
So, you found the tunnel.
Because of this, the Hill residence is determined unsafe for occupation. So, obviously, like a good neighbor, Dale offers to let the Hills stay with them. Oh, and then charges Hank for amenities while he stays there.
You'll see it's all listed here. Water, electricity, 2 rolls of toilet paper.
Dale's continued negligence leads to Hank accidentally cutting his finger off with a buzzsaw, which in context is very clearly Dale's fault. But Dale instead triggers a restraining order and forces Hank to go to anger management classes. Very petty, especially since literally everything is on Dale here. Throughout the episode, Dale continues to double and triple down on his stupidity, digging a new tunnel under the alley and very nearly getting himself, Bill, and Boomhower crushed to death by a garbage truck. Luckily, Hank saves the day.
Okay, Hank, now that we're out of the tunnel, what is so damn important?
In fact, in a lot of ways, Dale and Peggy have weirdly similar tendencies. I recently did a breakdown of Peggy's patterns, which, if you haven't watched, you should check out. But in that video, I talked a lot about how Peggy often will double down even after her failures and ultimately make things much worse for herself. For Peggy, this stems from stubbornness and overconfidence, but for Dale, it seems to stem from sheer stupidity. He's somehow got a combination of complete paranoia, monumental ignorance, and major naivete. And this comes into play over and over in the series. A perfect example is in To Kill a Ladybird, when Dale tries to capture a raccoon from under Hank's house. He gets scratched in the process, and then later in the episode learns that rabies can be transmitted through raccoon scratches. Now, this is a perfect example of Dale's paranoia and ignorance, because somehow Dale, a professional exterminator, did not know that raccoons can transmit rabies through scratches. Then his paranoia kicks in, and he instantly believes that he must have rabies because the possibility exists. God, this episode is a damn classic. One of my favorite unhinged Dale stories.
So long, suckers.
Speaking of unhinged Dale stories, Season 7's Vision Quest is another good example of Dale's intersection of paranoia and ignorance. When Joseph starts hanging with a bad crowd, John Redcorn becomes concerned. Dale, however, has a different response.
Those were the coolest kids I've ever seen, and they appear to be friends with my son.
Hank and John Redcorn try to induce a vision quest for Joseph, but instead, Dale has the vision. This vision basically explains to Dale that John Redcorn is Joseph's actual father. Like, very explicitly.
But he was a big guy, about yay tall and yay wide, and he was making love to my wife.
But instead of seeing the obvious answer, here's Dale's interpretation.
I fathered an Indian child, therefore I am an Indian.
This puts Dale's ability to believe even the most ridiculous things on full display, obviously, because Dale is, well,
You are the god-dang whitest person I've ever seen.
And not only that, he begins to talk about Native American beliefs and history with authority, even though he has no idea what he's talking about. Typical Dale. Joseph's new friends decide they want to break into the zoo and paint their names on a panda, and Joseph has a dream vision that basically tells him he needs to abandon those new friends. But of course, Dale misinterprets it, thinking he's now a real Native American.
By killing a panda.
This is easily one of the most deranged and dangerous things Dale has ever done. His ignorance put his own son's life and future at risk. It's something that's hard to reconcile, even though we've seen elsewhere that Dale can be a pretty good dad. Another classic Dale tale, trademark, is Soldier of Misfortune, which simultaneously shows Dale's general incompetence, but also how his unique personality can be used to his advantage. Dale is running for re-election of his gun club, and while telling a story about how he disguised himself as a flower delivery man to assassinate a dictator, Dale accidentally fires his gun. Pretty major mess up. This puts his re-election at risk and sends Dale spiraling. To make up for it, Hank, Peggy, Bill, and Boomhower decide to hire Dale's Soldier of Fortune services for a phony mission to give him a win. A pretty nice thing for his friends to do for him. But of course, in typical Dale fashion, he completely blows this incredibly simple mission and makes it way more complicated than it should have been.
The drugs that the drug lord will search for in each and every one of my cavities when I present him with an empty teddy bear.
This all culminates in Hank, Bill, and Boomhower being held hostage by Dale's gun club election rival Mad Dog, and to his credit, Dale does save the day, hiring flower delivery men to come to the gun club, knowing that Mad Dog and the other members would think it's an assassination attempt, like his previous story. It's a pretty fun win for Dale, even though everything was actually Dale's fault in the first place. This episode shows how Dale's conspiratorial nature continually gets in the way of any actual productivity or success. He assumes there's more to any story than there actually is. Another episode that showcases this tendency is A Dog Dale Afternoon, when Hank steals Dale's new riding lawnmower to teach him a lesson.
That's tomorrow's newspaper.
That's today's paper, Dale.
Of course, Dale takes it way too far, as usual, and believes that his mower's been stolen by Lee Harvey Oswald, who's of course the man who shot John F. Kennedy. Or allegedly shot, I guess. This is a Dale Gribble video after all. And then we have the rare case where Dale's conspiratorial nature is actually correct. One of my absolute favorite episodes of the series is Megalo Dale, when Hank sticks his neck out for Dale and recommends him to the Megalomart to deal with a rat infestation. But, of course, Dale being Dale, has a completely different interpretation.
I did too, until the evidence pointed to baboon.
Which then morphs into an even more ridiculous hypothesis.
It's Chuck Mangione.
When Hank realizes how off the rails Dale has gone, and that his own reputation is on the line for hiring Dale, he, Bill, and Boomhower go to the Megalomart to help Dale actually exterminate the rats. When they try to leave, they find that they've been locked in the Megalomart. Dang, I love this premise so much. It's just like a good spooky mystery. So much intrigue. They soon discover that two disgruntled teenage employees of the Megalomart have been the culprits behind the strange goings-on. So that's it, right? Mystery solved. Dale discovers that Chuck Mangione is in fact living in a toilet paper fort in the middle of the store. He's hiding to avoid the demands of the Megalo contract he'd been locked into, and for a little payback too.
But what about the droppings? There were droppings all over the place.
Dale rescues the boys from the teens, and Hank gives Dale the praise he deserves for a job well done.
Dale, I'd recommend you anytime.
And most interestingly, Dale never even tells them the truth about Chuck Mangione. Now, what I love the most about this episode and what it means for Dale is exactly that. Dale, for probably the first time in the series, has stumbled upon an honest-to-goodness 100% true conspiracy, and he literally solved it himself. This is the damn holy grail for Dale. It's something that completely justifies his outrageous beliefs, and yet, Dale is a good enough person to keep Chuck Mangione's secret, not even revealing it to his best friends. I think this says a lot about Dale as a person. It shows that while Dale does have a very out there way of thinking about things, he is in fact very secure in his conspiratorial beliefs. He didn't actually need the approval or validation that would come from being right about his Chuck Mangione conspiracy. He knew he was right, and that was enough for him. Now, whether or not this is a good thing for his own psyche or the effect it has on his friends and society, that's another question. But it is something I sort of admire about Dale. Although there is one occasion where Dale starts to feel pretty insecure about his own conspiracy beliefs. And that's when he visits Dallas, where John F. Kennedy was shot. In this episode, he realizes that the Warren Commission report actually does make sense, and that he might be wrong about his conspiracy. Now, instead of maybe just admitting he was wrong about this one thing, Dale goes in the complete other direction, and basically starts to simp for the US government, which at the very least makes for some very funny scenes. And it also makes Hank's fight to get his driver's license fixed so that it no longer says he's a female much more difficult.
If the government is so perfect, why did they send me a license that says I'm a woman, huh?
because you're a woman.
But in the end, Dale has an important revelation about Hank thanks to Nancy.
Back when you were crazy and thought the government was evil, who looked out for you?
And I think that Nancy makes a pretty interesting point. Dale's friends often see how deeply dangerous and ridiculous Dale's beliefs can be, and yet they're always looking out for his well-being. Hell, maybe that's why they're always looking out for his well-being. Maybe this all ties back to that loyalty that Dale has generally had to those closest to him. His friends sure are willing to put up with a lot of nonsense to make sure their friend isn't getting himself killed. Before we wrap up, I do want to address a pretty common conspiracy theory regarding Dale, because of course there are conspiracy theories about the conspiracy theorist. Some people think that because Dale is so skeptical of just about everything in the world, that he must actually know the truth about Nancy, John Redcorn, and Joseph. While I understand the inclination to believe this, I don't really buy into it myself. There are just too many examples of Dale's complete lack of basic awareness that are verifiably genuine. Plus, it sort of just flies in the face of the entire comedic premise. He's skeptical about everything except the most obvious thing that's right under his nose. I mean, just rewind this video if you want to look at all the things that Dale doesn't actually understand. The episode My Own Private Rodeo also showcases exactly what I'm talking about here. When Dale's father tries to reveal to Dale that he's gay, Dale somehow completely misses the point he's trying to make. Instead of understanding the very clear reality, he thinks that his father is actually a government agent. That's pretty standard Dale. He eventually learns the truth and makes up with his father, but it just goes to show where Dale's head is at. The obvious answer is never where Dale goes.
Quit screwing around with my mower.
And the answer in regards to Nancy, John Redcorn, and Joseph's true parentage is, well, so obvious. To me, it actually makes way more sense that Dale believes John Redcorn is actually giving his wife healing massages for over a decade. And it once again speaks to that loyalty and trust that Dale has for people he cares about. In the end, is Dale Gribble unknowable? I think to his friends, it's abundantly clear who Dale is. He's an incompetent conspiracy theorist who regularly puts himself and others in harm's way. But maybe to the audience, there are some more nuances that don't quite shine through to the people in his life. We get to see Dale when he's alone, or when he uncovered the truth about Chuck Mangione. We can see that there are some positive things hiding beneath the abrasive surface. But I also think that in the grand scheme of things, those nuances are a little too nuanced. We can appreciate them, but ultimately, Dale really is an incompetent, dangerous conspiracy nutcase. And while that might make him a dangerous person, it also makes him an incredibly fun and funny character. One of my favorites. If he were a real person, I'd be concerned. But since this is a comedic TV show, I kind of just love how secure Dale is in his own unhinged nature. Wait, what was that?
Muzak. Just Muzak.
So I've been debating who to cover next in my King of the Hill series, but my gut kept telling me, "You're getting the dang old Boomhower, I tell you what." And after getting a lot of comments echoing this sentiment, I figured it was the right move. But after digging through the episode lists, I was kind of shocked to realize that there are arguably only 2 episodes that primarily focus on a Boomhower story. He's got some B stories in other episodes, and he obviously tags along with the gang on a lot of adventures, but between Bill, Dale, and Boomhower, there is no question who has the least number of stories. But that isn't to say we can't dig into the character, because the few Boomhower stories we do have actually paint a pretty interesting picture. And the ultimate reveal in the series finale, that Boomhower is apparently secretly a Texas Ranger, can sort of help recontextualize some of the things we know about him. So join me as we explore Arlen's fastest talking and driving ladies man, Jeff Boomhower. And yes, his name is Jeff. They said it once.
Hello, Jeff. Oh my, it's the 15th already?
Boomhower is, to me, one of the most entertaining characters in King of the Hill. Yeah, he's a little bit gimmicky, but to me the gimmick doesn't get old.
It be.
I, Bobby Hill,
Now come cross my dang old heart, top man, I play the lead to tell you what, man.
do solemnly swear.
Especially when they keep finding new ways to deliver this same joke.
Boomhower, I can't understand a word you're saying. Must be the echo.
And honestly, it's even funnier when they subvert that joke. Like when we learn that he's actually an incredible bluegrass singer.
Yo, man, I'm gonna go now. I'm gonna take a verse right now. Blue moon of Kentucky, keep on shining.
Or when they show off the fact that he speaks French fluently.
Chérie, non nous pas. Nous avons encore cette nuit.
Sometimes his dialect actually is referred to in universe, even though our entire main cast seems to be able to understand him. Like when he's accidentally committed to a mental institution because the police and doctors have no idea what he's saying.
A threat to himself
Get out
and
there and go
others.
home, man. What'd he say?
Recommendation: 72-hour involuntary commitment.
Boomhower has an interesting history. He's been friends with the gang for his entire life, at least as far back as we've seen. It seems like he may have been a bit of a bad influence on them too. Well, at least he tried to be. Boomhower's father is a doctor and his parents live in Arlen, though it is implied in Three Coaches and a Bobby that they moved to Florida at some point.
Boomhower, how are you folks?
Man, they're doing fine, man. I'm down in Florida, man. I'm gonna lighter winter, man. Just no problems, man.
His Meemaw also seems to live in Ireland, or at least nearby, so it does appear that the family's roots are in Texas. In high school, Boomhower was the starting quarterback, and his love for fast cars and women seemed to date back to his teenage years at least. He had a Mustang named Miss Sally. He was clearly very popular, which makes sense. He was a taller jock with a nice car. Throughout the series, Boomhower is seen as a ladies' man. He has short-term relationships and one-night stands, and rarely seems interested in anything more than that. Honestly, Peggy said it best.
Hank, the man's longest relationship was a 3-day weekend.
I don't have anything against anyone who wants to live their life that way, but I do think it's interesting the way they portray this in the show. In I'm with Cupid, Boomhower shows off his so-called secret with women, which is ultimately just hit on every woman you see until someone says yes. It's not necessarily painted in a flattering light, though I guess it does get results that may be thwarted by a certain Hank Hill.
Whoa, Boomhower, that's the women's changing room. The men's is over there.
But I think what's most interesting about Boomhower is that ultimately, when the focus is aimed at him, it seems like this kind of life doesn't actually make him happy in the end. And I don't think that's necessarily an indictment on the lifestyle. I think it's mostly interesting from a character perspective. In season 6's Dang Ol' Love, we get our first real Boomhower-centric A story. The episode showcases Boomhower's tendencies when it comes to his single life, and that he doesn't seem to treat the women he sees particularly well.
Whoa, yo, man. Still here?
But when Boomhower falls for a successful woman named Marlene, he finds himself wanting more than a series of one-night stands, but Marlene starts to treat Boomhower the same way he treats his hookups.
I'm sorry. Did you forget something?
Boomhower actually goes to his Meemaw's house to get her family wedding ring to propose to Marlene. Yeah, this comes across as pretty fast, but it's interesting in the context of Boomhower and how quickly his desires shifted when the shoe was on the other foot. In a truly embarrassing situation, Boomhower proposes to Marlene while she's having an evening with another man, and Boomhower is absolutely bodied by Marlene in this scene.
Boomhauser? Okay, I'm gonna be honest with you. I only understand about half of what you say.
Honestly, I think the best part of this episode is how Boomhower ends up getting out of this depressive hole. It's actually Bill who helps him, somebody who is perpetually spiraling into sadness.
Because there's a train coming at you, carrying a boxcar full of heartbreak.
It's honestly up there with one of my favorite moments in all of King of the Hill. Bill's experience with heartbreak makes him the perfect person to help Boomhower see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Oh, yeah, man. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Whoa.
And in the end, Boomhower actually experiences some important growth, having now been on the receiving end of one of these types of relationships.
I felt that old big hurt, you know, and I just want to tell you, man, I don't want to tell you, I'm sorry.
I think this really shows how lonely Boomhower's life can be, even if that's perpetuated by his own tendencies sometimes. They further explore Boomhower's loneliness and regret in the season 8 episode Patch Boomhower, which introduces both Boomhower's brother Patch as well as his long-lost high school love, Catherine. Okay, first, let's take a moment to appreciate the fact that King of the Hill cast Brad Pitt. Yes, the Brad Pitt to play Patch Boomhower.
Dangle standing there, black t-shirt, looking all sharp, man, with the hair all scruffy on top that way, man. Come here.
Possibly one of the funniest pieces of casting in animation history, and honestly, Pitt makes a damn good Boomhower. This episode has Boomhower seemingly grow exhausted by his single life after learning that his brother is getting married. And to add insult to injury, Boomhower runs into his long-lost love, Catherine, which at first seems like serendipity.
Like a damn, talking about destiny, man. Talking about on planets line, you know, just like a big old dipper, man.
But this ends up being how he discovers that this is the person his brother Patch is marrying. The episode basically showcases Boomhower's frustration and heartbreak over this situation. Boomhower is even given a clear opportunity to reveal that Patch is sleazy, but he doesn't want to hurt Catherine. And though it hurts him, in the end, he resolves to let his brother and Catherine be happy together. Ultimately, Patch and Catherine don't get married because she learns that he's more of a sleazeball than even Boomhower realized, but Boomhower and Catherine don't get together either, though it is potentially left open for the future.
Like a dang old North Star, man. I'm always gonna be there, man. You know, just like a dang old GPS, it hurts gold, man.
I feel the same way.
But I think when you take into account that final episode reveal that Boomhower is actually secretly a Texas Ranger, it kind of paints an even sadder picture. Sure, it's a quick little reveal with no real weight in the episode, and yes, I've heard the theories that Boomhower was actually tasked with keeping an eye on Dale, and I think that's pretty fun, but I'm more interested in what it says about Boomhower as a character. This means that Boomhower's entire career was a secret from even his closest friends. That is a huge part of his life that he had to keep entirely to himself. Is it possible that the reason Boomhower has been so reluctant to get close to women in his life is because of the secretive nature of his career. Now, I know that Texas Ranger isn't necessarily a secretive career, but contextually in the series, it appears that Boomhower has been somehow undercover, or at the very least, very withholding about that side of himself. Does it explain his serial dating behavior and his lack of motivation to get close to people? I think when you tie into the fact that Boomhower's true desires to go steady with somebody special have revealed themselves in full force on a couple of occasions, there might be something to it. And if you look at how most people outside of Boomhower's personal life actually can't even understand his speech patterns, it paints an even lonelier picture. This guy has a completely secret career, he can't communicate with a large portion of the population, and he seems to be afraid to get close to anyone in a meaningful way. That is a lonely Texas Ranger. I think when people watch King of the Hill, they would likely look at a character like Bill and say, wow, what a sad life. But it's interesting that if you dive deeper, you can also say that about somebody like Boomhower. But despite this, Boomhower is portrayed as somebody with mostly good character, with the capacity for growth. Sure, there are a few situations where his behavior is questionable, but we've seen him learn from some of his more selfish actions. He's also shown to give good advice over the course of these series, and he exhibits a high capacity for forgiveness and understanding.
You know, Bobby, I tell him don't take for me, man. It don't life too short, man. You don't want to hold no grudge, man.
It's just another example of King of the Hill's incredible portrayal of very human and realistic characters, even if that character has a ridiculously unrealistic speech pattern.
You know, Mr. Boomhower, I can see why my dad is always quoting you.
Man, if my daddy quote me, god dang old man.
While talking about King of the Hill over the past couple of years, I've talked a bit about the very few times we've seen Hank Hill cry. I think the first time I said this was in my Bill video, and claimed that this was the only time I could ever personally remember Hank crying in the series. Every time I bring this up, I get at least a few comments talking about other times he's cried, and after my Cotton video a couple of months back, y'all made this massive comment thread of examples of Hank crying in the series. And these really got me thinking about Hank as a character. He is incredibly repressed, which is why we don't see him cry much. But is there any sort of common thread for what does make him cry? So I combed through all of the moments brought up in these comments, and I think we've got the definitive list of times Hank Hill has cried in the series. And it's pretty interesting stuff. So let's dive in and figure out what makes Hank Hill cry. So as we've sort of gone over in countless other videos, Hank is an incredibly repressed individual. I think the primary culprit here is of course his father, Cotton Hill, whose treatment of Hank as a child drastically affected how he would grow to carry himself as an adult.
I got my shins blown off by a Japan man's machine gun. So don't come crying to me with your problem.
There are actually a few examples of Cotton berating or belittling Hank for showing any emotion as a kid.
Hey, what you crying for, boy? It's a good show.
I want my binky back.
You want your binky back? You gotta come in firing!
Obviously, this isn't the only reason Hank is repressed. American society in general seems to want men to repress emotions like sadness. It's not manly, as they say. But Cotton is very representative of that society, and Hank's upbringing very much taught him to keep sadness to himself, buried deep down. Outward displays of pain or sadness are not manly. We even see an example of Hank as a teenager refusing to cry after literally breaking his ankle in a football game, staring straight-faced after the incident, and of course with Cotton berating him along the way.
This is your fault, and you got them weak ankles from your mommy.
So in the context of Hank's life, it has to take some seriously major baggage to get him to actually shed tears. Things that are deeply important to him. A few examples people give me in the comments were actually times when Hank came very close to crying, but didn't quite shed tears. But even these follow this pattern. The first is when Hank's brand new lawn was destroyed by Dale's gas in season 1. And this wasn't just any old grass.
It's Raleigh St. Augustine.
But when he walks out his front door and sees his completely dead lawn, he nearly loses it. Hank's lawn is more than just a yard to him, it's a point of pride. It's a status symbol. He sees the lawn as a reflection of his character.
My lawn's nothing but ragweed and auto parts. I should be ashamed to live next to Hank Hill. He's got the best lawn in Arlen.
And the absolute destruction of that lawn means the neighborhood will look down on his character every time they look at his property. So as far as Hank's values and worldview go, this makes a lot of sense why it would nearly drive him to tears. It's more than just lawn care to Hank. In season 6, Buck Strickland briefly promotes Hank to manager of Strickland Propane, and while he doesn't quite cry, he is completely overwrought with emotion, causing him to deeply embarrass himself.
Manager? Oh, Mr. Strickland, I love you.
Obviously, I think if he had cried here, it would have been a tears of joy situation, given that Hank had been the most driven and successful assistant manager that Strickland Propane had ever seen. On top of this, to Hank, Buck is sort of a surrogate father figure, and having never received that love from his actual father, this promotion clearly ignited a lot of deeply repressed feelings in Hank. But Hank's job is one of the most important things to him in his entire life. He prides himself on his work in Propane, and the promotion to manager is, frankly, something he deserves, yet has been denied continually. So, of course, this would totally overwhelm Hank. But the instances in which Hank does actually cry say even more about what's important to him. In season 1, in Hank's unmentionable problem, Hank is horribly constipated to the point where Peggy is severely concerned for his health, even having dreams about his death. And when she really breaks down about this to him, he breaks down as well and says how lucky he is.
To have a woman like you care so much about me, I'm going to be more open, tell you how I'm doing more, and let you in.
Now, this is season 1 King of the Hill, and sometimes the characterization was a little off in those first 13 episodes. I'm not sure I would expect Hank to say this in season 2 and beyond, but it's definitely interesting in the context of the episode, because the episode itself is literally called Hank's Unmentionable Problem, and his constipation is sort of a strong parallel to Hank being so repressed and unwilling to share his true feelings. They're both intimate aspects of himself that he finds embarrassing, and therefore doesn't want to reveal to the world, even his wife. There's a scene in the episode where Hank literally panics because Peggy is hugging him while he's on the toilet. He cannot even allow the love of his life to see him in that vulnerable position. It's pretty interesting. I do appreciate that he's brought to tears by how deeply Peggy cares for him, though. When he sees her imagine a life without him, he feels her pain, and this actually lines up pretty nicely with the next time we see Hank cry, in season 3's Death in Texas. This is a pretty standard Peggy gets in over her head episode, in which she unknowingly becomes a prison drug mule. She really thought the cocaine was just boggle timer sand.
He always tasted the timer sand when I brought it in. I didn't think anything of it at the time. He always said it was very good timer sand.
When she finally realizes her blunder, and it's looking increasingly like she could go to prison for a long time herself, Hank and Peggy reconcile with the possibility, and it's honestly a very sweet moment where Hank opens up emotionally far more than we typically see.
I'd hate to think where Bobby, Luanne, and I would be without you.
After this, the family plays whack-a-mole together while Peggy and Hank both cry at the thought of their family breaking up. Obviously, Peggy doesn't go to prison, but Hank's love for Peggy and his family is incredibly clear in this episode. And though it doesn't look like they animated full tears, the thought that he and Bobby might be left without Peggy is one of the few things in the series that drives Hank to publicly show this much emotion. In fact, he's actually gone out of his way to make sure he doesn't cry in public on other occasions. In season 4's To Kill a Ladybird, Bobby befriends a raccoon that he names Bandit. Eventually, it gets into a fight with Ladybird, and after scratching her, the pair run off, which obviously leads to major fears that Ladybird might contract rabies from Bandit. Hank goes out and puts up flyers everywhere to try and find her, and when he returns home, he goes into his garage, turns on his power saw, closes the garage door, and he wails. In the end, Ladybird fortunately did not have rabies, but there's even another instance in which Hank cries over Ladybird in season 5's episode Hank's Choice, when Bobby develops an allergy to Ladybird. In this one, Hank is once again faced with the possibility of losing his dog because of this allergy, so he instead builds her a doghouse to stay outside. He gets really emotional at the doghouse's grand opening for the neighborhood, though, as it means that Ladybird would be staying outside of his house for the first time in her life.
And we hope we have made your home as wonderful as you have made ours these past 13 years. Okay, Luanne, the champagne.
Now, obviously, Hank absolutely adores his dog. He has an incredibly special connection with Ladybird, but I actually think there's even more to Hank's particularly emotional state when it comes to Ladybird. After Hank and Peggy got married, they had a lot of difficulties conceiving Bobby, mostly because of Hank's narrow urethra. When it seemed like it just wasn't gonna happen, Hank got Ladybird for Peggy. And within a year of getting Ladybird, Peggy had conceived Bobby, and Hank credited them having the puppy as the reason that this was able to happen.
I always kind of believed that playing with that puppy was the one thing that finally relaxed me in my urethra.
So not only does Hank have a genuine 14-year-long bond with this dog, but she also represents to him the thing that allowed for his entire family to come to fruition, the thing that allowed he and Peggy to conceive his son. the first step to making their family complete. He has always seen her as an absolutely integral part of their family, and this is one of the big reasons. The next instance is probably the most embarrassing for Hank. In season 5's Chasing Bobby, they go to see a very sad, dramatic movie at the theater. As this older character, played by Charlton Heston, dies in front of his son, Hank breaks down.
I'm okay. Please continue to look at the screen.
Hank Hill is weeping like a little French girl.
Eventually, Hank breaks down even further, but it's revealed that the death of the character in the film was actually surfacing some of Hank's repressed emotions about his truck, which was beginning to break down.
I checked this morning, and there was water in the exhaust.
This might seem trivial at first, but earlier in the episode, they reveal how much time and work Hank has put in with his truck. He's always fixed her himself.
This truck has been through 4 presidents, 3 Cowboy Super Bowl victories, and 0 mechanics.
Hank has had this truck since the 80s, driven it every day, and put tons of care into its upkeep. He is invested in it. And when the car breaks down for good, it's gone. It's like losing a family member to Hank. There's a clear pattern here, but let's talk about this last instance of Hank crying before we break it down. In season 6's Tankin' It to the Streets, the gang goes on a wild adventure with Bill, who believes that the government experimented on him in the army, leading to his physical decline. In his frustration, he steals a tank from the army base and drives it through Arlen, so Hank and the boys do their best to try and help set things right, taking the tank back with him. When they accidentally drive it onto an artillery range, they are all in grave danger, but Bill takes the tank and acts as a decoy in order to save his friends. When the tank is then blown up, Hank and the gang understandably think that Bill is dead.
He's gone. Bill's dead.
Bill is literally one of Hank's oldest friends, as well as Boomhower and Dale's. They played football together in high school and have lived across the alley for years. The first shot of the entire series of King of the Hill is these 4 hanging out. They are without a doubt the closest friendships that Hank Hill has, and Hank can't keep in his real feelings for Bill. That he's a brave man, he's honest, he's sweet.
Like a big old stuffed teddy bear. Oh, God. I'm gonna miss him.
The entire gang cries for Bill here. Luckily, Bill of course made it out alive, but it's nice to see how much they love their friend. So, what is the pattern here? What does make Hank Hill cry? Personally, I think that's clear. Even as an incredibly repressed man who is completely embarrassed to show any sort of intimate emotion, at least in public, he cannot help but express himself when the things that he has invested his life in are threatened. Hank really only cries over things that mean a lot to him, things that he's really put work into and has personal connection with. He nearly cries when his lawn is destroyed, something that takes a massive investment of time and effort on his part. Ditto with his truck, with the added angle that this was something that reliably took him where he needed to go for well over a decade, something that gave back. He cries over the potential loss of those he loves most, whether that's when he thinks one of his best friends has died in a selfless sacrifice, his dog might be lost or rabid, or that his wife might be going to prison for unknowingly smuggling cocaine. In spite of his repression and his manly facade, Hank is still a very loving person with deep, meaningful attachments. And though it takes a lot, not even he can hide his emotions about the things that are most important to him. Recently, I made this video about the upcoming King of the Hill revival, breaking down some of the new details we've learned about next year's aged-up continuation. One of those details is that Bobby will be in a relationship, and by far, the most common comment I got was from fans who are going to be very upset if Bobby is not with Connie in this new series. And on one hand, I understand, their connection was a big part of the original show. They're a very likable couple. But on the other hand, I was a little surprised. Bobby and Connie dated when they were like 12 years old, and they weren't even together for the last 7 seasons of the series. But fans are very attached to Bobby and Connie as a couple. So today, I'm gonna look at the entirety of their friendship turned relationship turned friendship again and answer one question. Do Bobby and Connie belong together? Hey, this video is brought to you by 2 things today. One is my official compilation channel, Johnny2Cozy, where I'm re-editing tons of my old videos into themed compilations, long videos that are great for sleeping or drawing. And second, my wonderful patrons who get tons of extra content exclusive to Patreon. We're currently in the middle of season 2 of our BoJack Horseman audio commentaries. Check those out if they interest you. Thank you so much for your support. I couldn't do it without viewers like you. Connie was introduced midway through the first season of King of the Hill when the Supernusum phones moved to Arlen, right into the Hill's neighborhood. While the focus of the episode is more about Hank and Con's initial differences, it also shows that from the beginning, Bobby and Connie really got along.
He's new in town and he's only got one friend. Yeah, but at least you're not tied up.
The pair release Doggy so that he can play with Ladybird, only for him to run away. While searching for him, they bond over their dad's similarities and differences before they also release Ladybird to try and track down Doggy. None of this goes well, but this first episode showcases Bobby and Connie's immediate connection and friendship, which acts as a nice juxtaposition to Hank and Con's rocky start as neighbors. But the romantic connection between Bobby and Con Jr. doesn't begin until towards the end of season 1 with the episode Plastic White Female. Worried about going to Joseph's boy-girl party, Bobby practices kissing on Luanne's beauty school mannequin head, which, as you may recall, Hank was very stoked about.
You must have got it wrong. Maybe he just fell on it or something.
Connie isn't really in this episode much at all, but the end reveals that she has also got some of those same insecurities that Bobby does, and she practices kissing on her hand.
I want my first kiss to be perfect. You know, something sweet I can keep with me my whole life.
I really love this moment because even though Connie insists that the pair kissing each other is just practice and not the real thing, this is exactly that. It's a really sweet moment. Two friends going through uncomfortable changes, helping each other through them. While Connie may not have seen it as a real first kiss initially, she almost certainly did later in life.
Was that right? I think so. Do I have any hickeys?
One other aspect of the whole Bobby x Connie relationship that I don't think is talked about all that much is that there is a tiny bit of a love triangle with Joseph. Granted, it's not a major part of it and it only is really explored in a couple of different episodes, but it certainly is there. But the next big step in the Bobby/Connie story is the son that got away, the first hint at any sort of love triangle with Joseph. Bobby and Connie get in trouble at school for distracting each other during class, with their parents both obviously blaming the opposite's negative influence on their child. When they both get grounded, they end up running away together, but not before Joseph joins their escape. Initially, Connie is super annoyed by Joseph's intrusion, and the pair butt heads.
Bobby and I don't like to do that.
Well, Bobby and me do.
But they decide to go to the caves, and during this adventure, Connie and Joseph start to connect a little more, with Bobby starting to feel a little left out, especially after Joseph and Connie hold hands with each other when the light goes out. This is a pretty important episode in terms of Bobby realizing how much he likes Connie. He basically resigns entirely to the idea that she and Joseph are going to become a couple, even though it hurts him, when in reality, Connie and Joseph hadn't really even considered the idea.
You're upset together, and I'm upset all by myself.
Bobby even offers to sacrifice himself for their well-being, telling them that they can eat him if they need to, which definitely went a long way in terms of how Connie sees Bobby. Even though they already had a connection, this was a moment that changed her perception of him for the better.
Bobby, that is so kind and brave.
For the rest of season 2, Bobby and Connie are mostly explored through their connection as friends, and in some really fun ways. The episode Bobby Slam forces them to wrestle each other for a spot on the wrestling team, something that neither of them are eager to do. Rather than go through with it, they put on a huge WWE-style wrestling show for the school, entertaining their way out of their jam. But in season 3, another super important episode in their relationship occurs, and they call it Bobby Love. In this one, Bobby starts dating an older girl named Marie, who finds him to be very funny.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
The entire Bobby/Marie story is at the forefront of this one, and it's mostly about Bobby dealing with his first real crush and relationship and the heartbreak that comes in the aftermath. But happening alongside that are these scenes where we can see that Connie is super bummed that Bobby is dating someone else.
Bobby?
Bobby gets his heart broken thoroughly, and in retaliation, he eats a massive steak in front of the vegetarian Marie as his own sort of way to cope with the breakup, leading to this very sweet scene between him and Connie at the end.
Oh, when you finish, you want to come over to my house and watch some television?
While Bobby and Connie's chemistry was always apparent in their friendship, and there were hints at Connie feeling more for Bobby, this appears to be the first real time where Connie actively considers Bobby as a romantic partner, spurred on by his dating another girl. So while Bobby has obviously expressed interest in Connie, at least to Joseph and the audience, this was the first time it was very overtly reciprocated. And so, as you might expect, the follow-up Bobby x Connie episode, Love Hurts and So Does Art, is arguably the most important. This episode is basically all about Bobby's crisis about his relationship with Connie being taken to the next level.
About that kiss.
Oh, it'll be magical. Nothing will ever be the same between you and Connie ever again.
This is partially because of what happened with Marie and how difficult things got after they kissed, and mostly represents Bobby's fear that he might ruin his friendship with Connie in the process of elevating their relationship. As a coping mechanism for the stress, Bobby starts overeating at the Showbiz Deli, primarily chowing down on a sandwich filled with chopped chicken liver. This actually ends up giving Bobby gout, but even before he realizes this, he's using the symptoms as an excuse not to go to the dance with Connie.
Your toe will be better by next week.
Or it could be worse.
This is a really interesting storyline because while it might appear that Bobby simply doesn't want to give up eating at the deli, in reality, Bobby continues to eat at the deli so that he doesn't have to take Connie to the dance due to that aforementioned fear of ruining their friendship, which of course does nearly ruin their friendship when Connie finds out that he won't give up the liver.
You would rather stuff yourself and roll around in your stupid electric cart than take me to the dance?
Bobby does eventually come to his senses and realize that he wants to be with Connie after she lies to him and tells him that she's going to the dance with someone else, and Bobby makes the long trek to the dance to try and make his pleas to her.
What about your gout?
My dad says when you really want something, you play through the pain.
So this is the big turning point. Prior to this, Bobby and Connie's relationship was all friendship and flirtation, but after this, they are officially a couple. And honestly, I didn't really remember it taking this long, but from Connie's introduction to their official coupling, it took about 2.5 seasons, and the relationship lasts about 2.5 more seasons. This is kind of the key section for the series for us to analyze here. Prior to this, there's some great development built on their friendship and chemistry, but now is what it looks like when we actually see them together as a couple. There are many episodes that feature both Bobby and Connie in this era, but we're going to mostly take a look at the ones that put a focus on some aspect of their relationship. And the very first to do that after they get together is the episode Aisle 8A, really one of the only episodes that is super focused on Connie. I think most people remember this one. It's when Connie gets her first period while staying with the Hills, forcing Hank to try and help in a hilarious fashion. But the surrounding text of this episode is all about Bobby and Connie as a couple. Bobby is excited and nervous to have Connie stay at their house, going through all kinds of preparations to make sure things go right, and initially things do go great.
I'm glad you're here. We make a good team.
Well, let me hook you up with some more suds.
Aside from a slightly awkward moment as they fall asleep, they had a great time the first night. But the next day, Connie's attitude is completely changed, and Bobby questions whether or not it was his fault, whether or not he did something wrong.
And I took the liberty of snagging us each a piece of bundt cake.
I just brushed my teeth.
Obviously, this was a hormonal response, leading to Bobby really struggling to know how to move forward with Connie.
My mom says we shouldn't be alone together anymore and that you only want one thing.
Did she say what that was? Because I am so confused.
I really love this scene. It feels like a parallel of that first romantic moment where they practiced kissing with each other, both of them going through major life changes, struggling to adapt to them, and helping each other through it.
I don't want to dump you, Bobby. I still want to be your girlfriend. But for those 4 days when I'm a woman, I don't want to be anywhere near you.
All things considered, Bobby and Connie have a pretty healthy and communicative relationship, especially for 12-year-olds. The next episode about their relationship sort of follows these themes as well, basically trying to help each other navigate these more adult ideas as they get older. In Naked Ambition, their relationship nearly ends because Bobby foolishly helps Joseph try to peep on Luanne, making it seem like they were actually trying to peep on Connie. Connie even goes out with Shane Wasanasong in response, the boy that Con desperately wants her to date. After Bobby explains what really happened, they each take off their shirts together, sort of haphazardly exploring this kind of intimacy, even though they don't actually seem to have any real understanding of why. But again, it is them navigating their relationship, navigating these kinds of changes, navigating getting older together. Honestly, if there's any episode in the entire series that is a clear-cut argument for why Bobby and Connie should be together, even into adulthood, it's the next one. Won't You Pee My Neighbor? In this one, Buddhist monks come to Arlen in search for the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, believing it may be Shane or Connie. Shockingly, they end up believing that that person is Bobby, which Bobby actually takes to pretty instantly, until he finds out about the Lama's vow of celibacy, meaning that he can't be with Connie if he ends up being the Lama. So, when given this final test, Bobby says this:
I can pick anything I see on this rug.
Yes.
I pick Connie. Right there in the mirror.
made even more meaningful by the final reveal that the mirror Bobby was pointing to was the former llama's mirror. Bobby chose Connie over a life of reverence. He really truly cares for her. But in the beginning of season 5, Joseph returns to sort of reignite that love triangle. This is the first episode where we hear Joseph's new voice and see his growth spurt, which makes Bobby feel pretty inadequate. Bobby's immaturity really shines through in this episode. In an attempt to help Joseph and seem suave towards Connie, he creeps her out and pisses her off.
You did this so Joseph could watch? You're such a creep.
Oops. Time of the month.
Really one of Bobby's more embarrassing moments. Made worse when Joseph goes to apologize to Connie and the pair end up kissing. Bobby even punches Joseph twice for this, and then breaks up with Connie, though by the end of the episode, they all resolve their differences and the couple are basically still together at the end. But it's a good example of how, though their relationship was pretty strong throughout the series, it wasn't always the most stable. This is probably the most tumultuous event during the time they were together. There are some smaller things that turned Connie off as well, like in Hank's choice when Bobby starts living in Lady Bird's fancy doghouse. He doesn't exactly make himself look like quality boyfriend material in this one. And things get a little rocky in the hilariously titled Kidney Boy and Hamster Girl: A Love Story, in which Bobby and Connie pretend to be high school students with very specific ailments. Bobby does try to do some kind things for Connie in this episode, like take her to the high school prom, but most of his efforts come across as self-serving, trying to prolong his time spent in his high school charade. Bobby, of course, can't keep up the charade for long, but since he helped the high school get no doubt to play at their prom, the older kids throw him a bone and invite him to the prom anyways, an invite he extends to Connie, making it up to her. Overall, there are some fun and sweet Bobby and Connie episodes, many of which reaffirm their relationship even when there's conflict. And that even includes the episode that would ultimately be the end of their relationship, Father of the Bribe. In this episode, in a last-ditch effort to break them up, Con tries to bribe Bobby to break up with Connie. Ingeniously, the pair of them decide to use Con's money to get a hotel room so that they can hang out together uninterrupted. But because they now have to pretend that they aren't a couple, it puts a real strain on their relationship. And over the course of the episode, they actually realize that maybe right now their goals in life aren't aligned.
First time all week we've been alone and you're doing homework?
I'm not going to get into Harvard watching slasher films.
And by the end of the episode, despite the fact that they care deeply for each other, they both realize that maybe they actually should break up.
I think we should break up.
What? But I came here to break up with you.
And the pair end on really good terms, and they remain good friends. And what I love so much about their breakup is that it fits so perfectly with these major milestones in their relationship that led up to this point. Bobby and Connie are always there for each other to help learn and navigate through these major life changes and events. And going through a breakup is no different. That's one of these events. They talk each other through it. They reassure each other that things are going to be okay. And with their time left, they're there for each other.
We've still got 20 minutes left on the room. Maybe we could hold hands one last time?
Of course, though this initially goes well and the pair do remain good friends, that doesn't mean there aren't hiccups. The very next episode, I'm with Cupid, is all about Bobby's regrets, fearing that he'll end up like Bill, desperately wanting Connie back, and truly embarrassing himself in the process.
Cupid is here! He's got one arrow left, and it's going straight into Connie Super-Nusen-Pone's heart.
But for the most part, after the breakup, both Bobby and Connie move on. If I have any issues with their breakup, it's that Connie maybe gets less focus overall in the series once they split up. But overall, they remain good friends who support each other, and they both express interest in other people. In fact, the first real romantic entanglement Bobby has after Connie is with Connie's friend Jordan in Season 7's Get Your Freak Off. And not only is Connie totally cool with Bobby's interest in Jordan, she actually helps facilitate it, fully wingmans him while they're at a concert by pointedly swapping places with Bobby so that he and Jordan can be next to each other. Bobby shows interest in a lot of girls over the final 7 seasons of the show. There are occasional twinges of jealousy, like when Bobby wants to see Connie's cousin, Tid Pow, or when Connie expresses excitement over working with her crush, Russ.
What could you possibly be studying?
Mainly him. He's brilliant.
But for the most part, they just stay good friends and Bobby pursues other people. Sometimes foolishly, like the students he's advising as a student counselor, sometimes fleetingly, like the girl he plays DDR with in Japan. But after I'm with Cupid, there isn't really much drama in regards to Bobby and Connie's former relationship. They just remain great friends. So, To recap, the pair were flirtatious friends for about 2.5 seasons, they dated for 2.5 more seasons, and then they went back to being friends for the final 7 seasons of the series. Though the pair has really great chemistry and their relationship is incredibly likable, I think people are overlooking the fact that when it comes to its characters and character relationships, King of the Hill is a pretty realistic show. Bobby and Connie dated when they were 12 and 13 years old. While Hank and Peggy may have gotten together in high school and never separated, part of the entire point of the series is that Bobby is a drastically different person than his parents. It's very hard to imagine him continuing to date the same person through to young adulthood. On top of that, Connie and Bobby have entirely different goals in their lives, and at least for their young adulthood, it's hard to imagine those things lining up for them. So when it comes to whether or not Bobby and Connie should be together in the incoming revival series, in which both characters will now be 21 years old, let's look at things logically and from a story perspective, both in terms of what makes sense from the themes we've seen in their relationship, as well as the dramatic possibilities we can expect. I think it is unlikely that Connie and Bobby end up going to the same college. Connie expressed interest in going to Harvard, and though that doesn't necessarily have to be the outcome, it's clear that she has loftier ambitions when it comes to going to school than Bobby does. Knowing that Bobby will be working at a fusion restaurant in Dallas, it seems very unlikely that Bobby and Connie will have been together through college. We do know from Pamela Adlin's interviews that Bobby will be in a relationship in the new series, which I think very likely means he'll be dating a new character. And when it comes to dramatic potential, I'm sorry, but I don't think Bobby and Connie being a couple when the show picks up is particularly interesting. You know what would be interesting though is Connie moving home, having this long shared history with Bobby, which creates conflict within their existing relationships. I think them just being a couple again is kind of boring, but there still might be lots to learn about Bobby and Connie's friendship from where the show last ended through high school to where the new show is picking up. And who knows, maybe that eventually leads to them reconnecting in a more meaningful romantic way. But I think the show should want to earn that if they're going to move that direction. And furthermore, I think that the more important aspect of their relationship is actually those ways we saw them support each other while navigating these major changing stages of their lives. Even though that took place mostly within a romantic relationship, for me, I'm far more interested in seeing that dynamic continue than something romantic just for the sake of romance. I think there are a ton of possibilities when it comes to how the King of the Hill revival treats Bobby and Connie's long-standing friendship and history. But personally, I really hope it doesn't just default to them being a couple again, because it just feels a little bland and uninteresting. It doesn't feel like it really serves the characters or creates for any interesting stories or drama within their changing lives. As for the big question, do Bobby and Connie belong together? Well, that's maybe a bit more complicated. They certainly belong in each other's lives. They seem to be each other's most important friendship in a lot of different ways. Obviously, belonging together is not as cut and dry of an idea as it might seem in movies or TV, but I do know that if they don't end up together romantically, even eventually, it seems like they should always be there for each other. So I guess my answer is, yeah, Bobby and Connie belong together, even if that doesn't mean they necessarily need to be a couple romantically. It's here, our first look at the King of the Hill revival in motion, but they've opted to release the new intro sequence before a trailer, which I actually think was a really smart move. And also, there might actually be more to go over in this intro sequence than there would be in a regular trailer. So this video could be a long one. There is so much to go over and so much to speculate about. This is going to be a full frame-by-frame breakdown going over everything. There are also some major details laying out the new premise of the King of the Hill revival in the YouTube description for this intro sequence, and we're going to line a lot of that stuff up with what we see here in the intro. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so obviously it is the same old theme song from the original show. It actually probably would have been upsetting if they changed a song. This was always going to be the move. And this intro is emulating the time-lapse style of the original intro sequence as well. However, this is actually covering all of the events that take place in Arlen between the end of the original show and the start of the revival series, which is a really smart way to catch us up on what has happened and hint at what's to come. For those confused about the timeline, King of the Hill has always existed on a sliding or floating timeline. So this series is clearly going to be taking place in modern day. However, we've also gotten confirmation that the characters have only aged 8 years rather than the 16 years that have taken place between the 2009 finale and the 2025 revival. If that's still confusing to you, just think about the fact that Bobby was 11 years old when the show began and took place in 1996, but was also only 13 years old when the show ended and was set in 2009. Sliding timeline. This 8-year jump is also confirmed by the number of time-lapse season cycles we see in this intro sequence. The first year here we see must take place during the quote-unquote old series, and then we see 8 additional season cycles, moving it into modern day and aging everyone 8 years. The original intro sequence seemed to be a time-lapse of a single day, and obviously because this one takes place over many years, it gives us an insane amount of information. So let's start going over it frame by frame. It starts the exact same way as the old intro, though the animation does look a bit different, as you might expect with modern animation pipelines. We actually got 2 versions of the old intro during the original run, the one that ran for most of the show, and then they did an HD update on the back end of the series, mostly for like seasons 12 and 13 when they did HD episodes. This looks a bit different than either of those. The backgrounds are a lot less saturated than the old intros. The angle of the alley is actually a little different. We can see more of Hank's house in the background, but this first shot is definitely meant to take place in the past. The characters are all wearing their typical outfits and haven't aged yet. Then, when that beer cracks, we get an onslaught of information. We immediately see the seasons start to change, with the first transition leading into fall. Everyone's wearing jackets, or in Bill's case, a sweater. We see that Hank is wearing his Strickland propane jacket here. Then shift to winter. Everyone is more bundled up. Boomhower has like a full ski suit and goggles on. Dale has that full face mask we've seen him wear in the original series. And after this, spring hits, and we see young Bobby and Joseph, with Joseph sporting a skateboard. Bobby also has a smartphone here and can be seen filming Joseph skating. Obviously, again, this show is on that sliding timeline, so because of how things have shifted here, we know that some of Bobby's childhood has taken place during this smartphone era, which had just become a thing when the original show ended. But this could also hint at maybe Bobby and Joseph being interested in making and or sharing videos in some capacity. Bobby obviously had 2 major passions in the original show, comedy and cooking. It always made sense to me that if the show were to move forward, Bobby might have found video platforms such as YouTube or TikTok as a good means to showcase both his comedic talents alongside his cooking skills. Okay, so this information had previously been leaked by Pamela Adlon in an interview, but the YouTube description of the intro also says this about Bobby for the revival premise. Bobby is living his dream as a chef in Dallas and enjoying his 20s with his former classmates Connie, Joseph, and Shane. So we know that Bobby has become a chef at the young age of 21, but I think it will be really interesting to see how he rose to prominence in that field at that young age. It's also interesting to see that Connie, Joseph, and Shane are all in Dallas with him, and I think Shane will play an interesting role in Bobby's life here, which I'll go over later because it involves aspects of leaked information for the show. We won't go over that until the end of the video, in case you want to go in spoiler-free. Okay, let's get back to the time-lapse. While Bobby and Joseph are messing around with the skateboard, Connie comes in with a presentation board on global warming, which tracks for that character, obviously, and seems to draw the boys away to work on what I expect is a school project. As they're walking here, you can see Bobby is actually pretty stoked, likely because he's going to be spending time with Connie, where Joseph is not very stoked to be moving on to schoolwork instead of skating. Then we get a brief standard summer shot of the gang again, so this marks a full year of time lapses. Then back to fall with the warmer jackets. Here we can see Min walking doggy while Con follows after her, clearly very agitated. It seems like their relationship is on the rocks, which does line up with some of the stuff we've learned from leaks. And again, I won't go over those in detail until the end of the video in case you don't want full spoilers yet. Then we see in this next shot that Min is also responding angrily to Con. Their relationship definitely seems to be in a rough place. We then go back to winter again and very quickly to spring and to a rainy summer, so that's 2 years past. And the time lapse starts to speed up significantly more here. Basically, every quick transition is a season, another fall, another winter, but then at this winter, we see some really exciting stuff. Dee Dee arrives at the house to pick up Hank's younger brother, Good Hank, or GH, who is now a toddler. Last we saw Dee Dee was in season 13, where she announced that she was getting married to a wealthy professional wrestler, and her driving a nice convertible here might confirm that this has continued. The outfit we see her wearing in the intro is actually exactly the same as her previous appearance, which was also her final appearance. This also confirms that a couple years have passed, as now GH is a toddler and not a baby, and this is also where we get our first first look at an older Bobby. Now, as it takes place in the time lapse, this would make Bobby like 15 years old in this part, which means he must have hit his growth spurt around then. That's a pretty young age for him to have sprouted up so quickly. Though I do anticipate that we can maybe chalk this up to them just not wanting to design a new Bobby model, simply to be set between the young and older Bobby in the time lapse. But we see that Bobby is specifically playing with his uncle GH and seems to have been babysitting him as Dee Dee is picking him up, and this is something that I just genuinely love. When GH was born, Bobby was specifically shown to be the first to really care for him, and I love that this connection has continued over the years. It also seems like Bobby seems to have been watching GH over at Connie's house based on where he's walking from and back to afterwards. GH is one of the characters I am most interested in for this revival. He should theoretically be around 8 or 9 years old, and I'm so curious what his relationship with his older brother and his nephew Bobby are like. I expect that Bobby will be a bit of a role model for GH, the way a cool uncle would be, which is funny given that GH is actually Bobby's uncle, but it also makes sense since GH's father KotH also loved and adored Bobby so much. I am also incredibly curious about whether or not GH will have any interest in learning about KotH, and whether that will be facilitated through Bobby or Hank. I think that we could get a really great story about Hank learning to connect with his brother by having to navigate the awkward and uncomfortable nature of his own relationship with KotH, which was largely negative, while also trying to teach his younger brother about his own father without just fully ruining his own perception of the father he never knew. I also expect that we'll get some kinds of flashbacks to KotH at some point during this show. I mean, it would be a huge wasted opportunity if we didn't. KotH's one of the funniest characters ever. They're gonna find a way to get him in there. After this, we quickly see another spring and summer, so that is 3 years elapsed in the intro. Then in the fall, a development that I think many fans will not be particularly stoked about. It seems as though Nancy is back with John Redcorn as he's picking her up. She's dressed up pretty nice, putting on earrings as she walks to the car. Nancy had actually stopped seeing John Redcorn back in season 4 of the original series after reconnecting with Dale in the episode Nancy's Boys. This was always a development I appreciated, and it maintained through the entire remainder of the series, so it will be interesting to see how and why they've regressed in the years since the original show ended. I wonder if anything specific has happened with Dale, if there's some event that led to Nancy and John Redcorn reconnecting. We'll see. Then another quick winter, spring, summer, so that's 4 years elapsed, and the absolute biggest development of the entire intro sequence, Hank disappears from the group, and we see him, Peggy, and Bobby pack up their stuff and seemingly move away. Bobby gives Connie a very affectionate hug, but Joseph is the one who seems to be most torn up by this. He gives Bobby this massive bear hug while fighting back tears. I love this showcase of emotion from Joseph here. Bobby is shown to be such an important presence in Joseph's life, a friend who really helps him with his confidence, and it makes so much sense that this is a really difficult moment for them. This would theoretically be in the middle of high school when Bobby, Connie, and Joseph are like 17 years old, a really tough time to lose a best friend. Connie waves goodbye, and we see them both walk away very sadly after the Hills leave. Bill also absolutely loses it here, sobbing when Hank leaves. Dale also doesn't look very happy about it, but Bill just continues to sob even as the time lapse continues. So obviously the big question here is, what could possibly have convinced Hank to move away from Arlen? And I think it's clear that there is really only one thing that could have been the culprit, and luckily both the revival description and an interview with Vulture reveals a lot more detail about this. You might not be surprised to hear the answer is propane, and I'll go over this way more in depth once we cover the rest of the trailer. The time lapse continues into the fall, which gives us maybe our biggest WTF moment in the entire intro sequence, the new guy moving into the Hill residence through a moving truck service called Moving On, a little on the nose. We even see them replace that old school metal trash can that was from the original intro sequence, and it's being replaced here with one of the newer plastic bins. Then their new neighbor joins the gang, and as he approaches, Boomhower greets him. Bill still looks sad and unsure, and Dale remains completely emotionless. And next it jumps to winter with the new guy in Hank's old spot. They move through a couple more seasons, punch in and move through some more, but the time lapse actually sort of skips summer here. I think we can presume that this moved another year, marking the 5th year of the time lapse in the intro sequence. And then we actually get confirmation for exactly what year this takes place, because as soon as it hits spring, we see Bill start to cough and walk away, and the next thing we see is everyone wearing masks, moved further apart from one another, aka social distancing. So this is spring 2020 as COVID and the pandemic hit. We can see that Boomhower and the new guy are wearing masks, while Dale, predictably, is wearing his on his chin. That's the exact characterization we should expect from Dale, so they're kind of nailing it there. And then, even crazier, as we shift to summer, marking the 6th year of the time lapse, Boomhower actually walks away away to join a woman and what I presume is her son. It appears as though Boomhower has finally shacked up with somebody, and I think we can actually glean a lot from why and how this all went down. I do think that lockdown and the pandemic put a lot of people into a sort of existential headspace, forcing them to really try and figure out what's important to them. We did see Boomhower really yearn for a real relationship a couple of times in the original run, despite being the resident ladies' man. We saw this in episodes like Dang Ol' Love and Patch Boomhower, but I also think that being forced into lockdown and isolated probably really interfered with Boomhower's ladies' man tendencies, so actually forming a real connection in a difficult and existential time I think really tracks for Boomhower here. I'm really curious what we're going to learn about his new family, how they met, what his relationship with his maybe stepson is like as the show goes on. Boomhower and his new lady friend walk away, and he actually doesn't return, nor has Bill since getting COVID, leaving just the new guy and Dale. Next, Dale excitedly tears his mask off as a newer, older character model for Joseph approaches with a bunch of "Vote Gribble for Mayor" signs. So, seemingly in the aftermath of the pandemic, Dale has decided to run for mayor of Arlen. I am particularly curious just how much support Dale has gotten in his mayoral campaign. I personally don't expect that he has actually succeeded in this run, but I guess it is possible. In this Vulture article, Judge Daniels and showrunner Saladin K. Patterson talk about how Dale's conspiratorial views don't feel as fringe as they used to. I imagine even if he did not become mayor, that Dale will have more diehard supporters than we might be comfortable with. Dale posts the sign on the telephone pole, does a little excited dance and walks away, leaving our new guy all alone. Next, we see the phone company come in and remove the old telephone pole. This lines up with the fact that we pointedly see a 5G tower in the background of the new poster that released a couple of weeks ago. A modern technological advancement for sure. Dale returns again just to put a new "Vote Gribble for Mayor" sign in the yard, and our new guy stands alone in the alley until the spring, at which point he pulls his mask down, drinks his beer, and walks inside. Then we see summer, fall, winter, spring 2 times in quick succession, seemingly moving forward 2 additional years, when a car pulls up chauffeuring Hank and Peggy back to the neighborhood. The car itself has a logo on it that reads "Trip" with a Y and 2 P's, clearly a modern take on Lyft. Hank and Peggy have both visibly aged. Hank's hair has faded a bit. Peggy's sporting a slightly new hairstyle. They both have more wrinkles and bags. Hank is wearing a new shirt, the one we saw in the poster. Peggy also has a new outfit, but is still very reminiscent of her old one. Hank looks at Dale's mayoral sign, which has been in this yard for like 3 years, picks it up, and walks it to the trash, paralleling the way he walked the garbage bag to the old trash can in the original intro sequence, with the back of the sign now reading "Created by Mike Judge and Greg Daniels," as did the garbage bag in the OG. And just like in the original, older Bobby now runs from off-screen to join them as they embrace as a family, leading to the classic Hank head rotation intro title card. Looking at this now, it does look like this Bobby model is actually even a bit older looking than the one we saw in the middle of the intro sequence. Also has a new outfit, but I do still think that Bobby grew pretty quickly in this intro sequence, given that it was just 2 years after his child model. And then we get the release date reveal, releasing August 4th, which is 1 week before the previously leaked date of August 11th. So that's exciting. We're like just over 2 months away. I am, however, far, far less excited for the fact that they're going to be releasing all 10 episodes on the same day. That actually might be the thing I am most upset about in this entire revival. The show is perfect for weekly discourse and discussion. Dropping it all at once severely takes away from the excitement the fan base can build week by week. I'm actually pretty mad about this. I really, really hate binge release models. I think they do the products a disservice. I think if shows like Invincible and Severance have proven anything, it's that hype can build week to week and that the discussion is integral to getting more and more people into a show. The King of the Hill revival is going to come. Everyone's going to watch all 10 episodes and they're going to forget about it until the next season releases, and that sucks. Okay, so let's talk about the biggest takeaways from this intro sequence. I think the first and most important thing we have to talk about is the Hills moving away from Arlen, and as I mentioned earlier, the reason for this is propane, but more specifically for Hank's career. Here's what the official logline for the revival reads. After years working a propane job in Saudi Arabia to earn their retirement nest egg, Hank and Peggy Hill returned to a changed Arlen, Texas to reconnect with old friends Dale, Boomhower, and Bill. Okay, so let's talk about this. I'm sure a lot of people who don't understand this plot decision are already yelling about it on Twitter and in comment sections, but the explanation and reasons behind this move are pretty sound, especially if you understand the place and circumstance that Hank and his family would be moving to. Saudi Arabia is one of the world's leading producers and exporters of propane. Hank, meanwhile, never never even managed to be promoted to manager at Strickland. He is a man who is fully dedicated to propane, but Buck Strickland never really showed that he was truly committed to Hank, despite years of top-notch service at the company. I mean, it's crazy that he wasn't manager by the end of the show. I expect that at some point, Hank was slighted again and not called up to be manager, and decided to take his talents somewhere where he can actually save for retirement and be appreciated. I guess it's also possible that maybe Buck Strickland helped facilitate this opportunity for Hank, but I feel like Hank wouldn't leave Strickland unless he felt like he had to. But for those wondering why Hank might move somewhere as different as Saudi Arabia, the answer is actually because where he moved is likely not very different than what he's used to. Here is a quote from Greg Daniels from a Vulture article about this revival setup. "We liked the idea that he had been gone for a while, and the most Mayberry kind of freezer that you could put a family in was an Aramco base, which is like an idealized kind of white picket fence America. They had gone to Saudi Arabia, and they were just coming back and had missed out on a lot of recent cultural changes. So if you actually understand the kind of place the Hills would be moving to, you'd see it doesn't really threaten Hank's worldview. In fact, it's a place that sort of fosters his worldview. These Aramco bases are like these sort of company towns, as Daniels described it, like an idealized white picket fence America. Very up Hank's alley. And so this actually does a few really great things for the revival's premise. One, it gives a reason we're picking up where we are. Hank and Peggy have moved back to Arlen. A good pilot always has a reason that the story is picking up where it is. Two, Daniels described this as a Mayberry kind of freezer, a reference to the town where Andy Griffith takes place. Hank living in this sort of idealized white picket fence community, working in propane, isolated from the larger, more drastic changes we've seen in the surrounding culture, gives him an even more interesting point of view when returning to Arlen. Not only are Hank's sensibilities going to be challenged by modern culture, but Hank himself hasn't even been able to process these changes at all over time, as many others have. He's going to be confronted by a modern culture in a much bigger, more impactful way than if he had been in Arlen for the last half decade or so. So this entire show is once again about Hank being confronted by a changing world, just as the original was, but they have effectively placed Hank in a position where he'll be forced to reckon with the major technological and cultural shifts we've seen over the past couple of decades, all at once. It's going to be very interesting, because it puts Hank in an even bigger fish out of water position than he even was in before. I also think that this might explain who this guy that moved into the Hills house is. It doesn't really make sense that the Hills would be gone so long and then just move back into their old house. So it seems like they have likely either rented it out to someone else, or it's also possible that this is someone here on some sort of work exchange program. Particularly when you note that it looks like this shirt he's wearing is a lot like the Strickland propane uniform. There does seem to be a lot of buzz around IMDb and the Reddit about a character listing for a guy named Muhammad, and I think it is very possible that this is that guy. And I think that name would lend credence to the work exchange theory. We'll see what role he plays in the season as a whole. I'm pretty eager to see what they do with him. The Vulture article also goes on to talk about how the show is dealing with some of the voice actors who have died since the original run, and it was just officially revealed that King of the Hill vet Toby Huss will be replacing the late Johnny Hardwick as Dale, which I think is a pretty great option that Johnny would probably be happy with. Toby previously played Con and Cotton, and now he'll be taking on an even bigger, more important role as Dale, and I expect he'll do a really great job. It does appear as though we'll still be getting about 6 episodes with Johnny Hardwick as Dale before the transition, and it will be his final performance ever, and I'm really looking forward to being able to hear that. But this intro also had a notable lack of Luanne, Lucky, or their daughter Gracie. Obviously, Brittany Murphy and Tom Petty passed away years before the revival, so they wrote the show with that in mind. The Vulture article claims that Luanne and Lucky were written to have moved away, which I do think is a good move. It would have been really sad if they had killed their characters. However, I was very much looking forward to the possibility of Gracie being a major character to help keep Luanne's spirit a part of the show. I do hope they manage to find a way to bring her in at some point. Luanne was one of my favorite characters, and if she's still out there somewhere, I really hope they find a way to update us on her life in a meaningful way that honors Brittany Murphy. But I am incredibly excited by the fact that we got visual confirmation of GH in the title sequence, especially considering they barely touched on Good Hank at all after he was born. And the fact that the family is seemingly returning from a long stint overseas will make for a really interesting dynamic between GH and Bobby and GH and Hank. I expect Good Hank will have grown a lot and they'll be seeing him as like a fully functioning child for the first time. I'm curious if GH will feel any resentment towards Bobby for leaving, since it seems like they had a really important connection while Bobby was still around. Though it also seems like Bobby may have returned to Texas before Hank and Peggy, maybe for college, since we see Hank and Peggy arrive back to Arlen without without Bobby in tow in the intro. Speaking of, let's talk about the whole Dallas crew, which is basically an entire sort of new sub-series premise here, with Bobby, Connie, Joseph, and Shane Wasana-san. Shane being the really interesting inclusion, but based on what we learned from that Grey Delisle leak last year, this tracks. I think Shane is the one who is financing the fusion restaurant at which Bobby is a co-owner and chef, which according to that chef's bio that she leaked is called Robata Shane. This makes sense, he had a rich family, so it wouldn't be surprising to me if he was using this wealth to finance this sort of fusion restaurant and using Bobby's skills as a way to elevate that restaurant. But I think the most surprising thing here to me is that Connie is in Dallas. I fully expected Connie to have gone to like a major Ivy League school further away from Texas. Maybe the Supanusum phones couldn't afford to send her to that kind of school and had to send her to a state college. If Con went through a rough patch at work, that could also lend to the friction we see between him and Min in the intro sequence. This friction is also reinforced in those leaked storyboards, which I think I will refrain from talking about in depth here because I want to keep this to be just about the intro sequence. But if you want to hear my thoughts about those storyboards in detail, I did a video on my Johnny 2 Casual channel going over them and giving my thoughts. If I were to voice my concerns about anything we've seen so far, it would be that it seems like there are a couple of things that feel like slight story regressions for the sake of recreating a familiar dynamic from the original show, even when the original show had moved past those dynamics. In particular, if Nancy and John Redcorn are still together, that is a prime example of this. There is also one other major thing revealed in those aforementioned leaked storyboards that super lends to this concern as well, but again, not going to talk about those in depth here. However, there are also so many clear instances of the show moving certain characters into new places with new dynamics. In particular, the intro showed us the Boomhower familial development. And again, check out those storyboard leaks for a couple other examples. But I think I am mostly very excited about the direction they're going here because it seems like Judge, Daniels, and Patterson all have a great grasp on what makes the show good to begin with and what not to do with a modern reboot. This quote from Daniels in that Vulture article talks about how the conflict in King of the Hill has always been cultural, not political. It always was a very specific show. It's about these characters who live around this alley. It's a character comedy. I hope no one has an expectation that it's a late night show. Animation takes a long time. We're not ripping headlines. It's about character and culture. And to me, that is incredibly reassuring. This is going to focus on these characters and what we can expect from those characters within this modern culture. Patterson also said this: I think focusing on small, relatable things was the way that we were able to steer clear of things that were gonna feel like gratuitous satire, on the nose, or just ineffective. To me, it really feels like this could be one of the great revivals. I really just trust Judge and Daniels, and it seems like they have a really great sense of how to approach these characters returning to our screens. It's not just the show returning in a modern setting, it's giving us a new entry point for characters who are at entirely new places in their lives, facing entirely new dilemmas and milestones. I'm so grateful that the show feels like a sequel and not just a modern remake, and also that it's giving us so much to speculate about and get excited for just through this intro sequence alone. You should stay tuned because I will for sure be covering a lot of the revival as it comes. Please let me know below in the comments what you think about the revival intro, about the premise, the characters, what we can expect to see, and stay tuned for more. Peace.